Have you ever wondered what happens when the world's most powerful people meet in absolute secrecy? No cameras, no reporters, no records, just influence, wealth, and decisions that might shape your future without you ever knowing. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most enigmatic gatherings in modern history, a meeting that doesn't want to be found. Before we begin, if you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps us out tremendously. We'd also love to know, what time is it where you are? Drop a comment telling us where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing our global community come together. And if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, don't forget to subscribe. It keeps us going. Now, let's step into the shadows of power. Each year, in locations that change but remain carefully guarded, approximately 150 of the planet's most influential figures convene for 3 days. They arrive in unmarked vehicles. They stay in hotels cleared of other guests. They discuss matters that concern billions of people. And when they leave, they take their conversations with them. No minutes are published. No photographs are released. No formal statements are issued. This is not fiction. This is Bilderberg. The questions that surround this annual gathering have persisted for 70 years. What can be decided when democracy's most powerful figures meet without democratic oversight? What policies take shape in rooms where the public is explicitly excluded? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what influence can be exercised when there is no documentation, no accountability, and no way to prove what was or wasn't said? Tonight, we examine the conspiracy theory that has grown around these meetings, a theory that asks whether the most important decisions affecting our world are made not in parliaments or congresses, but in private conference rooms where the only rule is silence. The story of Bilderberg is not simply about a conference. It is about power itself, how it functions when freed from public scrutiny, how it perpetuates through networks invisible to those it governs, and how it shapes reality while leaving no fingerprints. This is a story about the space between what we are told and what actually occurs, between democratic theatre and oligarchic reality, between the world we see and the world that sees us. Chapter 1. The First Gathering. The year was 1954. Europe was still rebuilding from the devastation of World War II. The Soviet Union had detonated its first hydrogen bomb. The Cold War was intensifying. McCarthyism gripped America. Stalin had died only a year earlier, and the post-war order remained fragile, uncertain, contested at every border and in every ideology. And in the quiet Dutch town of Oosterbeek, inside a hotel called Bilderberg, something unprecedented was taking place. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands stood as host. Beside him was Joseph Rytinger, a Polish political advisor whose network of contacts spanned continents. Rytinger was the kind of man who appeared in no headlines, but whose influence threaded through post-war European reconstruction like invisible wire. He had connections to intelligence services, to resistance movements, to the Vatican, to socialist parties and conservative governments alike. He was a networker in an age before the term existed, a man who understood that power often operates most effectively when it operates quietly. Together they had assembled a guest list that read like a directory of Western power: prime ministers, finance ministers, corporate executives, military leaders, and intelligence officials. David Rockefeller represented American financial interests. Dean Acheson, former Secretary of State, brought Washington's perspective. European politicians who would shape the continent's future for decades sat alongside industrialists whose companies were rebuilding that continent's infrastructure. The stated purpose was straightforward enough: to strengthen transatlantic relations, to foster understanding between Europe and North America, to build bridges between the democratic nations of the West, in an era when those bridges seemed essential for survival against Soviet expansion. The meeting lasted 3 days. Discussions covered economics, defence, and political strategy. Participants debated the future of European integration. They explored the relationship between economic reconstruction and military security. They considered how to prevent the nationalist conflicts that had twice devastated the continent within a generation. When it concluded, attendees returned to their respective countries, and the world continued on, unaware that anything particularly unusual had occurred. But something had been established, a precedent, a format, a network. The Bilderberg Group had been born. What made this gathering different from other international conferences was not its agenda, but its structure. There would be no press releases, no official statements, no minutes distributed to the public. The Chatham House rule would govern all discussions. Participants could use the information they received, but could never reveal who said what. Prince Bernhard framed this privacy as essential for candour. Politicians and business leaders, he argued, could never speak honestly if their every word might appear in the next day's newspapers. Real dialogue required confidentiality. Real understanding required trust. In public forums, he contended, people performed for audiences rather than engaged with each other. They staked out positions rather than explored possibilities. They defended institutional interests rather than pursued common ground. The privacy, he insisted, was not about hiding impropriety. It was about creating space for genuine conversation. Critics would later frame that same privacy differently. They would call it secrecy. They would question what kind of understanding requires such absolute discretion. They would ask why the powerful needed protection from public scrutiny when they were discussing matters of public concern. But in 1954, those questions had not yet crystallized. The first Bilderberg meeting was simply an experiment in informal diplomacy. Whether it would continue remained uncertain. It continued, and with each subsequent year the format solidified. The network deepened. The influence, whether real or perceived, grew. What began as a single gathering of concerned elites became an institution. What was framed as a one-time experiment became an annual ritual. And what was meant to foster transatlantic understanding became something that would haunt the imagination of conspiracy theorists for generations. Because when powerful people meet in secret, even for noble purposes, they create a vacuum that fear and speculation will inevitably fill. Chapter 2. The Structure of Secrecy. The late 1950s, Bilderberg had established a rhythm. Each year, a new location. Each year, a carefully curated guest list. Each year, 3 days of discussion behind walls that might as well have been fortress barriers. The invitation process was, and remains, opaque. There is no public application, no transparent selection criteria, no announced roster of attendees until, in some cases, days before the meeting, and even then, only partial lists are released. Who decides who attends? A steering committee composed of former attendees. The committee's membership is not fully public. Their selection process is not documented. Their criteria are not explained. This opacity is not accidental. It is foundational to how Bilderberg operates. The steering committee reviews potential attendees based on criteria that include influence, expertise, and the ability to contribute meaningfully to discussions. But what meaningful contribution means in practice is left to the committee's judgment. And that judgment is exercised in private with no external accountability. What emerges is a pattern. The guest list consistently includes politicians, prime ministers, cabinet members, members of parliament, senators, governors. These are not fringe figures or backbenchers. They are current or future leaders, people at the centre of political power or ascending rapidly toward it. Financiers, central bank governors, investment executives, hedge fund managers, banking CEOs. The financial sector is always heavily represented, often comprising a quarter or more of the total attendance. Corporate leaders, CEOs of technology firms, energy companies, media conglomerates, pharmaceutical corporations, defence contractors. The companies represented are not small enterprises but multinational giants whose decisions affect millions of workers and billions of consumers. Intelligence figures, directors of security agencies, military strategists, defence contractors, former intelligence officials who maintain connections to current operations. Their presence is acknowledged but rarely emphasised in official materials. academics, policy researchers, economists, think tank directors, university presidents, but not academics generally, specifically those whose research influences policy or whose institutions shape elite consensus, media executives, publishers, editors, broadcasters, prominent journalists. Again, not media broadly, but specifically those who control major platforms or whose reporting influences elite opinion. The gathering is international but distinctly Western. European and North American attendees dominate. Occasionally participants from other regions appear, but the core remains transatlantic. This geographical concentration is rarely explained, but is consistent with the organization's founding purpose of strengthening Western alliance structures. This composition raises immediate questions for conspiracy theorists. Why do those who shape economic policy meet privately with those who benefit from that policy? Why do intelligence officials discuss matters with journalists who are supposed to report on intelligence activities? Why do political leaders coordinate with corporate executives outside the democratic process? The official answer has never wavered. Bilderberg is merely a forum for discussion. No votes are taken, no resolutions are passed, no binding agreements are made. It is simply an opportunity for influential people to exchange ideas in an environment free from political posturing and media sensationalism. The meetings follow a consistent format. Morning sessions typically address economic matters. Afternoon sessions focus on political and security issues. Evening gatherings are less formal, allowing for relationship building and private conversations that may be as influential as the structured discussions. Each session is led by a moderator, usually a member of the steering committee. Topics are announced in advance, though only in the broadest terms. Current economic challenges might mean anything from monetary policy to tax reform to trade negotiations. Security concerns could encompass everything from terrorism to cyber warfare to nuclear proliferation. Participants are encouraged to speak freely. The Chatham House rule means that while they can use information shared in discussions, they can never attribute that information to specific individuals. This creates a paradoxical dynamic. Everyone in the room knows who said what, but no one outside can ever be certain. The conspiratorial counterargument is equally consistent. Privacy enables influence without accountability. When the people who make decisions meet with the people who fund campaigns, lobby governments, and control information flows, the absence of records becomes convenient. What cannot be documented cannot be investigated. What cannot be investigated cannot be challenged. And so the Chatham House rule, intended to foster honesty, becomes something else in the eyes of critics. It becomes a shield, a mechanism not for candour but for deniability. Consider what this structure enables. A politician can discuss policy with a corporate executive, receive detailed analysis of how that policy would affect specific industries, and return home to implement that policy, all without any public record that the conversation occurred. A journalist can hear government officials preview decisions not yet announced, shape coverage accordingly, and never disclose the source of their insight. A central banker can coordinate with financial executives about upcoming monetary policy changes, and market movements that follow can never be definitively linked to private information sharing. None of this requires explicit conspiracy. It simply requires that people who share interests and perspectives meet regularly in private, develop relationships, and allow those relationships to inform their subsequent decisions. But the effect is the same: power operating outside democratic accountability. The secrecy extends beyond the meetings themselves. Attendees are strongly discouraged from discussing their participation, even in general terms. Hotels are secured days in advance. Staff are carefully vetted. Communications are monitored. The perimeter is controlled by security services that are never fully explained but always present. This level of security raises its own questions. If these are merely academic discussions, why the fortress-like protection? If no decisions are being made, why the absolute prohibition on recording devices? If the gathering is innocent, why does it require the kind of security apparatus typically reserved for heads of state at war? The standard response is that such measures are necessary because of the prominence of attendees. With so many influential figures in one location, security becomes essential regardless of the nature of their discussions. But critics note that plenty of international conferences bring together equally prominent figures without such extreme measures. The World Economic Forum in Davos is far more open, with extensive media coverage and public statements. G7 and G20 summits operate with transparency about participants and outcomes. Academic conferences regularly feature government officials and corporate leaders without military-grade security. So what makes Bilderberg different? What requires this particular combination of influential attendees, absolute privacy, and fortress-like security? The official answer is that the privacy itself necessitates the security. Because discussions are confidential, the risk of surveillance or infiltration increases. The security protects the privacy, which enables the candor, which produces the value. But this circular logic is precisely what conspiracy theorists find suspicious. The secrecy requires security. The security reinforces secrecy. And the combination of both makes external scrutiny impossible, and so the structure endures. Year after year, the same format, the same opacity, the same careful curation of attendees, the same fortress-like security, the same absolute prohibition on documentation. It is a structure designed to enable power to meet with power, influence to coordinate with influence, wealth to align with wealth, all outside the mechanisms that are supposed to make power accountable in democratic societies. Whether this is necessary pragmatism or dangerous oligarchy depends entirely on what you believe about how power should function. But either way, the structure itself is undeniable, and its implications are impossible to ignore. Chapter 3. The 1962 meeting, Saltsjöbaden, Sweden. Spring 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was still months away, but Cold War tensions saturated every discussion of international policy. The Berlin Wall had been standing for less than a year. Nuclear arsenals on both sides of the Iron Curtain were expanding at an alarming rate. The possibility of catastrophic war felt less abstract than it had since the end of World War II. In Washington, the Kennedy administration was navigating the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and increasing commitments in Vietnam. In Moscow, Khrushchev was consolidating power while managing tensions with China. In Europe, the scars of division remained fresh, with families separated and freedoms curtailed across the Iron Curtain. Inside the conference rooms in Saltsjöbaden, a luxury resort on the outskirts of Stockholm, Bilderberg attendees discussed European security arrangements. They debated the future of NATO. They considered economic integration as a counterweight to Soviet influence. They explored the relationship between military strategy and diplomatic positioning. The attendee list that year included several figures who would shape the decade ahead. Paul-Henri Spaak, former Secretary-General of NATO, provided military perspective. European politicians who would drive integration efforts were present. American officials who would influence Kennedy administration policies participated. Financial leaders whose institutions would fund European reconstruction attended. These were not small matters. These were questions that would determine the security architecture of the Western world for decades to come, and they were being discussed by individuals who, while influential, held no elected mandate to negotiate on behalf of nations. They were politicians meeting outside their official capacities. They were business leaders with no formal role in defence policy. They were journalists whose job was supposedly to report on such discussions, not participate in them. The discussions covered nuclear strategy. Attendees debated whether the American nuclear umbrella provided adequate deterrence or whether European nations needed independent capabilities. They considered the political implications of various deployment scenarios. They explored how public opinion could be shaped to support necessary security measures. This last point is particularly significant. Multiple participants had backgrounds in public relations, media, and political communications. The question was not merely what security policies were needed, but how to build public consensus around those policies. This is where the conspiracy theory finds its footing. Not necessarily in claims of explicit coordination, but in the more subtle question of unofficial consensus building. If the political leaders of multiple nations meet privately and discuss a common approach to security policy, and those same leaders then return home and implement similar policies, can that be called independent decision-making? If financial leaders coordinate their understanding of economic challenges before those challenges become public crises, does that constitute market manipulation or simply informed planning? If media executives hear government officials preview security threats and coverage subsequently emphasises those threats in similar ways across multiple outlets, is that journalistic coordination or simply shared recognition of important stories? The line between discussion and coordination, between exchange of ideas and formation of strategy, becomes difficult to trace when no records exist. Consider what happened in the months following the Salzburg meeting. Across Western Europe, governments began moving in coordinated fashion toward deeper integration. Trade barriers were reduced, joint institutions were strengthened, public discourse shifted toward emphasizing shared threats rather than historical conflicts. In the United States, the Kennedy administration adjusted its approach to European relations. Nuclear sharing arrangements were formalized. Economic partnerships were expanded. The rhetoric of transatlantic unity became more pronounced. Media coverage across Western nations began showing remarkable similarities. Stories about Soviet threats appeared with increasing frequency. Analysis pieces about the necessity of Western unity became common. Editorial positions across major newspapers aligned toward supporting integration and collective security. Were these developments the natural result of shared challenges and common interests? Or were they, at least in part, the fruit of private meetings, where consensus was quietly shaped before public debate ever began? The answer depends on what you believe about power. If you believe that democracy functions through open deliberation and transparent decision-making, then Bilderberg is an anomaly that requires scrutiny. If you believe that complex governance requires informal channels and private dialogue, then Bilderberg is simply a pragmatic tool. But either way, the meetings continued, and the guest lists grew more impressive. By the mid-1960s, Bilderberg attendance had become a marker of elite status. To be invited was to be recognized as someone who mattered, someone whose voice carried weight, someone whose participation in private discussions might influence public outcomes. This created a self-reinforcing dynamic. The more influential the attendees, the more valuable the networking opportunities. The more valuable the networking, the more people wanted to attend. The more exclusive the attendance, the more prestigious the invitation. And at each stage, the secrecy intensified. Because the more powerful the attendees, the more sensitive the discussions. The more sensitive the discussions, the greater the need for privacy. The greater the need for privacy, the more elaborate the security. And the more elaborate the security, the more suspicious the whole affair appeared to outside observers. Conspiracy theorists would later point to the 1960s as a period when Bilderberg's influence was most visible. European integration accelerated dramatically. Transatlantic defense, relationships deepened. Economic policies across Western nations began to show striking similarities. The common market expanded. NATO structures solidified. Currency arrangements that would eventually lead to the euro were discussed and debated. Educational exchanges increased. Cultural programs proliferated. The apparatus of Western unity was being built piece by piece, decision by decision. And at each step, Bilderberg attendees were present. Not necessarily directing outcomes, but participating in discussions, building relationships, forming networks that would persist long after the meetings concluded. This is the subtle nature of influence. It does not require smoking guns or explicit conspiracies. It simply requires that the right people talk to each other regularly, develop shared understandings, and allow those understandings to inform their subsequent actions. Whether this constitutes undemocratic coordination or pragmatic diplomacy cannot be definitively determined, but what can be said with certainty is that by the end of the 1960s, the Western alliance looked remarkably cohesive. More cohesive than might be expected from nations with different interests, different political systems, and different historical grievances. And Bilderberg, meeting annually throughout this period, had provided a forum where that cohesion could be quietly cultivated away from democratic pressures and public accountability. Chapter 4. The Political Launchpad Theory. One name appears frequently in conspiracy discussions about Bilderberg: Bill Clinton. In June 1991, the governor of Arkansas received an invitation to that year's Bilderberg meeting in Baden-Baden, Germany. He was not yet a presidential candidate. He was a regional politician with national ambitions but limited national profile. His chances of winning the Democratic nomination, much less the presidency, were considered uncertain at best. He attended. He participated in discussions. He networked with European leaders, American financiers, and media executives. He left. 16 months later, he was elected President of the United States. This sequence is factual. It is also, for conspiracy theorists, deeply suggestive. Clinton was not the only politician whose career trajectory changed dramatically after attending Bilderberg. The pattern repeats with striking regularity across decades and across nations. Tony Blair attended the 1993 meeting in Athens, Greece. At the time, he was Shadow Home Secretary, prominent within Labour, but not yet party leader. Within a year, he became Labour Party leader. Within 4 years, he became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Angela Merkel attended the 2005 meeting in Rottach-Egern, Germany. She was already prominent in German politics, but her path to the chancellorship was not assured. Within months, she became Chancellor of Germany, a position she would hold for 16 years. Emmanuel Macron attended the 2016 meeting in Dresden, Germany. He was economy minister at the time, having never held elected office. He had no political party. His presidential ambitions seemed quixotic at best. Within a year, he became President of France. The pattern repeats. A relatively prominent politician, not yet at the peak of power, receives an invitation. They attend. Within a few years, they ascend to their nation's highest office. Correlation, of course, is not causation. These individuals were already on upward trajectories. They were already recognised as rising leaders. Their attendance at Bilderberg might simply reflect the steering committee's ability to identify future leaders, not to create them. The steering committee, after all, includes people with extensive political experience and networks. They observe political developments closely. They likely have good instincts about who will rise and who will fall. Inviting politicians on the cusp of power might simply demonstrate prescience, not influence. But conspiracy theorists propose a different interpretation. They suggest that Bilderberg functions as a vetting process, that attendance is a signal, that the informal networks formed at these meetings provide access to campaign funding, media support, and policy expertise that can be decisive in close elections. They point to the presence of media executives at Bilderberg. Major newspaper editors attend. Television network presidents participate. Publishers and broadcasters whose outlets shape public discourse are regular guests. And media coverage can be the difference between a successful campaign and a failed one. They note that major donors often have connections to Bilderberg attendees. Financial executives who attend the meetings control funds that flow to political campaigns. Corporate leaders whose companies provide campaign contributions are part of the network. The relationships formed at Bilderberg create channels through which resources can move. They observe that policy expertise matters in modern campaigns. Candidates need detailed positions on complex issues. They need advisors who can help them navigate technical debates. And many of the academics and think tank directors who attend Bilderberg are precisely the people who provide that expertise. They question whether the distance between attendance and election is coincidence or coordination. When a relatively unknown politician attends Bilderberg and then, within months, begins receiving positive media coverage, substantial campaign funding, and high-level policy advice, does that reflect recognition of inherent merit? Or does it reflect decisions made in private to support that particular candidate? There is no smoking gun, no leaked email confirming that Bilderberg selects presidents, no recorded conversation in which a steering committee member explicitly promises campaign support in exchange for policy commitments, but there is a pattern. And patterns, in the absence of transparency, become fertile ground for theory. The official Bilderberg response has always been the same. Attendance is an honour, not an endorsement. It is recognition of a leadership potential, not an attempt to shape leadership outcomes. The fact that attendees often rise to high office simply reflects the quality of the selection process. This response is not entirely implausible. Intelligent observers might genuinely recognize future leaders before those leaders become obvious to everyone else. Inviting rising politicians might simply reflect good judgment about political trajectories, but critics remain unconvinced. They argue that when the world's most powerful people meet privately with emerging leaders, influence is inevitable. Money flows through channels that cannot be easily traced. Support manifests in ways that are difficult to prove, but impossible to ignore. And by the time the new leader takes office, the relationships have already been established, the expectations already set. Consider how campaigns actually work. A candidate needs several things to win: name recognition, funding, media coverage, policy expertise, and organizational support. Bilderberg attendance provides access to all of these. Name recognition comes from networking with influential people who can open doors. A favourable mention from a respected political figure can transform an obscure candidate into a serious contender. Funding flows through networks. Wealthy individuals who attend Bilderberg control foundations, corporations, and personal fortunes. Their support, or the support of people they know, can provide the resources needed for competitive campaigns. Media coverage is shaped by relationships. Editors and publishers who attend Bilderberg decide what stories get prominent placement. Journalists who participate determine which candidates receive serious, substantive coverage versus dismissive treatment. Policy expertise comes from academics and think tank professionals. Many of these attend Bilderberg. A rising politician who networks effectively can gain access to advisors who help develop detailed policy positions. Organizational support, the apparatus of campaign infrastructure, requires connections to political professionals, consultants, and operatives. Many of these professionals have connections to Bilderberg attendees. So when a politician attends Bilderberg and subsequently launches a successful campaign, are they succeeding because of inherent merit, or are they succeeding because they gained access to networks that provide the resources necessary for success? The answer is probably both. Merit matters, but merit without resources rarely succeeds in modern politics, and Bilderberg provides access to those resources. Whether this constitutes a conspiracy or simply the natural functioning of elite networks is a question that cannot be definitively answered. What can be said with certainty is this: Bilderberg attendance and political ascension have coincided with notable frequency, and in the absence of records, the interpretation of that frequency remains a matter of belief. For conspiracy theorists, the pattern is clear. Bilderberg is where future leaders are selected, vetted, and granted access to the networks necessary for success. The meetings are not merely discussion forums, but rather auditions, where rising politicians demonstrate their alignment with elite interests and their willingness to operate within acceptable parameters. For defenders, the pattern simply reflects good judgment. The steering committee recognizes talent and potential. They invite promising leaders. Those leaders, being talented, subsequently succeed. The success validates the original selection. But underneath both explanations lies an uncomfortable truth. In either case, political leadership is being shaped through processes that operate outside democratic accountability. Whether through conspiracy or through elite networking, the people who might lead nations are being evaluated and supported by individuals who were never elected to perform that function. And that reality, regardless of how it is interpreted, represents a challenge to democratic theory. Because if leadership is determined not by voters but by private networks, then democracy becomes a formality, a process that ratifies choices already made elsewhere, by people meeting in rooms that most citizens will never enter. Chapter 5. Economic Influence. The 1970s brought economic turbulence that shattered post-war certainties. The Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971, ending the fixed exchange rate regime that had governed international finance for a generation. Oil shocks disrupted global markets in 1973, and again in 1979. Inflation surged across Western economies. Recession followed. Unemployment rose. The economic certainties of the post-war era dissolved into stagflation, a combination of stagnant growth and rising prices that defied conventional economic wisdom. And through it all, Bilderberg meetings continued. With increasing frequency, the guest lists included central bank governors, finance ministers, and the heads of major financial institutions. The 1973 meeting took place in Saltsjöbaden, Sweden, the same location as the 1962 gathering. That year's discussions focused heavily on energy policy and monetary stability. Among the attendees were representatives from major oil companies and government officials responsible for energy regulation. The timing is notable. The meeting occurred in May. In October, OPEC announced an oil embargo against nations supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Prices quadrupled. Western economies, dependent on Middle Eastern oil, reeled from the shock. Gas lines formed, industries struggled, inflation accelerated. Conspiracy theorists would later ask, were those discussions in May merely analytical, or did they include strategic preparation? Did the attendees simply discuss the possibility of supply disruptions, or did they coordinate responses in advance? And if responses were coordinated, whose interests were prioritised? The public's, or those of the energy companies whose executives were in the room? No minutes exist to answer these questions. No recordings capture what was said. The Chatham House rule ensures that even if someone in that room knew something significant, they could never attribute it to a specific source. But some patterns are evident from subsequent actions. When the oil crisis hit, certain financial institutions seemed better positioned than others. Specific energy companies navigated the disruption with remarkable effectiveness. Government responses across Western nations showed surprising coordination, despite having no formal mechanism for that coordination. Were these outcomes the result of advanced knowledge shared at Bilderberg? Or were they simply the natural result of competent analysis by skilled professionals who happened to have met a few months earlier? The question cannot be definitively answered, but it illustrates the problem with private meetings of powerful figures during consequential moments. Even if nothing improper occurred, the absence of transparency creates space for suspicion, and suspicion, once established, is difficult to dispel. The same pattern appeared in subsequent years. The 1977 meeting in Torquay, England, occurred during a period of intense debate about economic policy. Keynesian approaches, which emphasised government intervention to manage economic cycles, were being challenged by monetarist theories, which emphasised controlling money supply and limiting government spending. The debate had profound implications. Keynesian policies meant continued government investment in social programmes, infrastructure and employment. Monetarist policies meant austerity, reduced government spending, and greater reliance on market mechanisms. At Bilderberg that year, the attendee list included prominent monetarist economists, central bankers sympathetic to restrictive monetary policy, and corporate executives who would benefit from reduced government regulation. The discussions, though never documented, almost certainly addressed the ongoing policy debate. Within a few years, the economic consensus had shifted decisively. Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in 1979 and immediately implemented austerity measures. Ronald Reagan became President of the United States in 1981 and pursued similar policies. Across Western Europe, social democratic governments gave way to conservative administrations that embraced market liberalisation. Austerity became the dominant approach across Western nations. Government spending was cut, regulations were reduced, markets were liberalised. State-owned enterprises were privatised, unions were weakened, social safety nets were reduced. Again, conspiracy theorists saw coordination where others saw organic change. They noted that many of the political leaders who implemented these policies had attended Bilderberg. They observed that the economic theories favoured at Bilderberg aligned perfectly with the interests of the financial institutions represented there. They questioned whether the shift in policy was driven by evidence and democratic mandate or by private consensus formed in closed meetings. The counter-argument is straightforward. Ideas spread. When intelligent people gather to discuss challenges, they naturally influence each other's thinking. The fact that similar policies emerged across multiple countries might simply reflect shared recognition of economic reality. not conspiratorial coordination. Keynesian approaches had failed to resolve stagflation. The combination of unemployment and inflation defied the traditional policy toolkit. Monetarist theories offered an alternative that seemed to address the crisis. Political leaders, facing economic emergency, adopted the available alternative. That these leaders had discussed economics with each other and with sympathetic economists at Bilderberg might have facilitated their understanding of monetarist theory. But facilitation is not conspiracy, education is not coordination, and shared understanding is not proof of improper influence. Yet the timing remains striking, and the composition of the meetings remains suggestive. When central bankers meet with investment executives, when finance ministers discuss policy with hedge fund managers, when the line between public interest and private profit becomes difficult to discern, skepticism seems reasonable, even if proof remains elusive. Consider the practical effects of the policy shift. Austerity measures reduced government spending, which meant fewer public services and reduced social support. Deregulation reduced restrictions on financial institutions, which meant greater freedom for speculative investment. Privatization transferred public assets to private ownership, which meant profit opportunities for those with capital to invest. In other words, the policies that emerged after Bilderberg discussions in the late 1970s consistently favoured the interests of the financial and corporate sectors, the same sectors heavily represented at those meetings. This could be coincidence. Economic crisis creates opportunities for policy change, and monetarist theory happened to be available when crisis struck. The fact that monetarism benefited financial interests might simply reflect that sound economic policy often aligns with market efficiency. But it could also be coordination. Financial and corporate leaders, meeting privately with political leaders, could have advocated for policies that served their interests. They could have framed monetarism as economic necessity while downplaying alternative approaches. They could have promised support for politicians who implemented favourable policies, while withdrawing support from those who resisted. No documentation exists to prove which interpretation is correct. But the pattern is undeniable. Economic policies shifted dramatically in directions that benefited Bilderberg attendees, and those shifts occurred after meetings where attendees discussed precisely those policies. For conspiracy theorists, this is not coincidence but causation. Bilderberg, in this view, is where economic agendas are set. Policies that will benefit financial elites are discussed, refined, and promoted. Political leaders who attend are brought into the consensus, and when they return to their positions of power, they implement that consensus as though it emerged from democratic deliberation rather than private coordination. For defenders, this interpretation overestimates both the coherence and the influence of Bilderberg discussions. People at these meetings have diverse views, they debate and disagree, and ultimately policies are implemented by elected officials responding to constituency pressures, not by shadowy coordinators executing secret agendas. But what both interpretations acknowledge is that economic policy of profound consequence was being discussed in private forums by people whose interests were directly affected by that policy, and whether those discussions influenced outcomes or merely reflected broader trends, the fact that they occurred in secret remains troubling for anyone who believes that economic policy should be shaped through transparent democratic processes. Chapter 6. Intelligence Community Presence. One aspect of Bilderberg that receives less attention than political or economic discussions is the consistent presence of intelligence officials. Directors of intelligence agencies have attended, high-ranking military officers have participated, defence, contractors have been regular guests, and while these attendees represent only a fraction of the total participants, their presence raises distinct questions about the nature of the gathering. Intelligence operations, by definition, require secrecy. National security discussions cannot be conducted in public forums. But Bilderberg is not a government meeting. It is not subject to legislative oversight. It does not operate under the same constraints as official diplomatic channels. So when intelligence officials meet privately with journalists, what is the nature of that interaction? When military strategists discuss security challenges with corporate leaders whose companies profit from defence contracts, Where does strategic planning end and conflict of interest begin? When classified information holders gather with media executives who shape public perception of security threats, what boundaries prevent the manipulation of public opinion through selective information sharing? These questions have no clear answers because the discussions themselves remain secret. But the structure creates opportunities for problematic dynamics. The 1981 meeting in Bergenstock, Switzerland, took place during a particularly tense period of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan in December 1979. NATO was deploying new missile systems in Europe. Arms control negotiations were stalled. The Reagan administration, newly in power, was pursuing a more confrontational approach to the Soviet Union than its predecessors. Among the attendees that year were several figures with direct ties to intelligence agencies. The exact nature of their connections cannot be confirmed. Intelligence affiliations are rarely advertised, but enough is publicly known to establish a pattern. Former CIA directors have attended. Officials from European intelligence services have participated. Defence contractors with security clearances have been regular guests. The discussions, as always, were private. The content was never documented, but the context was security policy during a moment of heightened tension. 18 months later, political developments in Europe seem to reflect a coordinated Western strategy. Media coverage of Soviet activities intensified across multiple outlets simultaneously. Public support for defence spending increased in several countries at once. Political leaders across multiple nations adopted strikingly similar rhetoric about Soviet threats. Conspiracy theorists suggest that the coordination began at meetings like Bilderberg, that intelligence officials used these forums to share assessments and coordinate messaging, that the informal nature of the gathering allowed for discussions that would be impossible in official channels, where bureaucratic constraints and democratic oversight apply. The theory goes further. In official intelligence channels, information sharing is governed by protocols and treaties. Classified material has legal protections. Oversight committees monitor intelligence activities. But at Bilderberg, these constraints disappear. Intelligence officials can share information without formal authorization. They can discuss operations without documentation. They can coordinate strategies without congressional or parliamentary approval. This creates a parallel structure for intelligence coordination, one that operates outside legal frameworks and democratic accountability. Whether this structure is used for legitimate strategic planning or for manipulation of democratic processes depends entirely on the intentions of participants, and those intentions, like the discussions themselves, remain opaque. Media presence at these meetings adds another layer of complexity. When intelligence officials meet with journalists and media executives, the potential for information operations becomes significant. Intelligence agencies have long used media channels to shape public perception, a practice known in the trade as perception management, or, more bluntly, propaganda. If intelligence officials brief journalists at Bilderberg about security threats, and those journalists subsequently report on those threats in their outlets, is that independent journalism or coordinated messaging? If the briefings include classified or sensitive information that gives the journalist competitive advantage, does that create obligation or compromise? The relationship between intelligence services and media has always been complex. During the Cold War, the CIA's Operation Mockingbird involved relationships with hundreds of journalists. Similar programs existed in European intelligence services. These relationships were eventually exposed and supposedly ended, but the structural incentives that created them remain. Bilderberg provides a perfect environment for rebuilding such relationships under conditions of absolute privacy. No one outside the meeting can know what intelligence officials tell journalists. No documentation exists to prove that classified information was shared improperly. And the Chatham House rule ensures that even if journalists use information from those discussions, they can never reveal the source. This arrangement benefits intelligence services by providing channels for shaping public perception without fingerprints. It benefits journalists by providing access to high-level sources and information unavailable to competitors. And it benefits both by occurring in a setting where the relationships themselves remain invisible to oversight bodies and the public. The 1991 meeting in Baden-Baden, Germany, occurred just months before the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Cold War was ending. Intelligence agencies faced uncertain futures. Defence budgets were threatened by peace dividends. The entire security apparatus built over 45 years seemed suddenly obsolete. Discussions at that meeting almost certainly addressed this transformation. Intelligence officials needed to justify their continued relevance. Defence contractors needed to identify new threats that would sustain spending. Political leaders needed frameworks for understanding the post-Cold War world. Within a few years, new threats emerged in public discourse. Terrorism became a primary concern. Rogue states replaced the Soviet Union as the justification for military spending. Humanitarian intervention provided new rationale for defence capabilities, and across Western nations, intelligence budgets remained robust despite the absence of the Cold War threat that had justified their creation. Were these developments organic responses to genuine security challenges, or were they, at least in part, the result of coordinated threat construction by intelligence and defence communities seeking to preserve their institutional power? The question is particularly relevant given Bilderberg's role. If intelligence officials, defence, contractors and media executives meet privately to discuss security challenges, and those same parties subsequently benefit from public perception of intensified threats, the potential for self-serving coordination is obvious. This does not mean that the threats are fabricated. Terrorism is real. Rogue states exist. Security challenges are genuine, but the emphasis placed on particular threats, the resources allocated to address them, and the policies implemented in response are all subject to influence. And that influence can be exercised most effectively when key players meet privately, outside democratic accountability. For conspiracy theorists, Bilderberg is where the national security state coordinates its strategies and shapes its narratives. Intelligence officials brief media executives, who then shape public perception. Defence contractors identify profitable threat scenarios, which politicians then prioritise. And the entire process occurs in secret with no documentation and no oversight. For defenders, this interpretation attributes too much coherence to what are simply informal conversations among security professionals. Intelligence officials discuss challenges, journalists ask questions, defence experts offer perspectives, and ultimately policies emerge through normal democratic processes, informed but not determined by these private discussions. But what both interpretations acknowledge is that people with enormous power over security policy and public perception meet regularly in secret. And whether those meetings produce coordination or merely coincidental alignment, the fact that they occur outside public view remains troubling in democratic societies that depend on civilian oversight of intelligence services. Chapter 7. The Media Paradox. Perhaps the most striking feature of Bilderberg is the participation of media executives and prominent journalists, and the corresponding silence about Bilderberg in mainstream media coverage. Editors of major newspapers have attended. Television network executives have been regular guests. Publishers and broadcasters whose outlets shape public discourse have been part of the annual gatherings for decades. These are not peripheral figures, but people who control the platforms through which most citizens receive information about the world. And yet, until relatively recently, those same media organisations provided minimal coverage of Bilderberg itself. The meetings were rarely reported. The guest lists were seldom published. The existence of this annual gathering of powerful figures was, for most of the public, completely unknown. This creates a paradox. The people whose job is to inform the public about concentrations of power are themselves part of a concentration of power that operates in secrecy. The journalists who report on government decisions behind closed doors are participating in discussions behind closed doors. The media executives who advocate for transparency in public institutions operate within an opaque private network. The 1991 meeting in Baden-Baden, Germany, illustrates this tension. Among the attendees were senior editors from The Economist, The Financial Times, and several other major publications. Also present were politicians actively involved in debates about media regulation, telecommunications policy, and press freedom. What was discussed? What perspectives were shared? Did the politicians provide insight into upcoming policy changes? Did the media executives commit to particular editorial approaches? Did relationships form that would influence subsequent coverage? No one outside that room can know. The Chatham House rule forbids attribution. No journalist in attendance could report on what was said without violating the agreement that allowed them to be there in the first place. This creates a structural conflict of interest. Journalists are supposed to maintain independence from the subjects they cover. They are supposed to scrutinise power, not participate in it. They are supposed to inform the public, not coordinate with officials outside public view. But Bilderberg membership requires exactly the opposite. It requires journalists to accept that some discussions should remain private. It requires them to participate in networks with the people they are supposed to scrutinise. It requires them to prioritise the value of informal access over the principle of transparency. Conspiracy theorists see this as proof of coordination. They argue that media coverage is shaped by relationships formed at Bilderberg, that the reason Bilderberg itself receives so little attention is because the people who would normally provide that attention are complicit in maintaining the secrecy. They point to the uniformity of coverage on certain issues. They note that across multiple outlets, the same narratives often emerge simultaneously. During the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003, major media organisations published strikingly similar arguments supporting invasion. During the 2008 financial crisis, coverage emphasised bailouts as necessary, rather than exploring alternatives. During debates over austerity in 2010, editorial positions across publications aligned towards supporting spending cuts. In each case, the consensus reflected the interests of Bilderberg attendees. Invasion of Iraq served security and corporate interests represented at the meetings. Bailouts protected financial institutions whose executives attended. Austerity aligned with the preferences of the economic elite who participate annually. Were these editorial positions reached independently, based on evidence and journalistic judgment? Or were they influenced by private discussions and relationships formed at Bilderberg? The structure makes the latter plausible. If senior editors attend Bilderberg and hear compelling presentations about security threats, they might return to their newsrooms inclined toward coverage that emphasises those threats. If they develop relationships with officials who frame economic challenges in particular ways, they might be more receptive to those framings in their editorial decisions. None of this requires explicit direction or conspiracy. It simply requires that people who attend Bilderberg, people who are already elite, already sharing certain assumptions, already operating within similar worldviews, reinforce each other's perspectives through regular private interaction. Media organisations respond that their participation does not compromise their independence, that their journalists attend in their personal capacity, not as representatives of their publications, that the insights gained at Bilderberg help them better understand complex issues, which in turn improves their reporting. This defence is not entirely without merit. Journalists do need access to high-level sources. They do benefit from understanding elite perspectives, and there is value in informed reporting that reflects sophisticated understanding of complex issues. But the structural contradiction remains. How can a journalist maintain independence while participating in the very networks they are supposed to scrutinise? How can a media executive claim impartiality while meeting privately with political and economic leaders their outlet is supposed to hold accountable? The answer, perhaps, is that they cannot, at least not fully. And that realization that even the institutions designed to expose concentrations of power are themselves embedded in those concentrations is what makes the media paradox so unsettling for those who believe in democratic accountability. Consider what this means in practice. When a major newspaper's editor attends Bilderberg, develops relationships with government officials, and then returns to oversee coverage of those officials, can the coverage be truly independent? When a television network executive meets privately with corporate leaders and then makes decisions about what stories get airtime, can the network serve as effective watchdog? The traditional answer would be that professional ethics maintain separation. Journalists are trained to distinguish between sources and subject matter, between access and advocacy. Editors understand their obligations to readers. They don't let personal relationships compromise editorial judgment. But Bilderberg challenges this assumption, because it's not merely about relationships with sources, it's about membership in an elite network. It's about shared assumptions, common worldviews, and mutual interests. It's about becoming part of the power structure rather than remaining external to it. This transformation is subtle but profound. A journalist who attends Bilderberg doesn't necessarily become corrupted or compromised. They don't necessarily start deliberately shaping coverage to serve elite interests, but they do become part of a particular class, the class that meets at Bilderberg, that shares certain assumptions, that operates within certain boundaries. And from that class perspective, certain questions become unthinkable. Certain challenges to power become unimaginable. Certain forms of scrutiny become impossible, not because they're forbidden, but because they no longer occur to people who have been integrated into elite networks. This is the deepest form of media capture, not crude censorship or explicit direction, but structural integration that shapes coverage through shared assumptions rather than imposed restrictions. The 1999 meeting in Sintra, Portugal, occurred during the Kosovo War. NATO was conducting airstrikes against Serbia. The intervention was controversial, lacking UN authorization, and raising questions about sovereignty and international law. Media coverage during this period was overwhelmingly supportive of intervention. Major newspapers editorialized in favor of action. Television networks featured military analysts explaining the necessity of strikes. Alternative perspectives questioning the intervention received minimal attention. Among the Bilderberg attendees in Sintra were military officials involved in planning the intervention, politicians defending the operation, and media executives whose outlets were covering the war. Were editorial decisions influenced by those private discussions? Did relationships formed at Bilderberg affect how the war was covered? Did media executives come away from the meeting with perspectives that shaped their outlet's approach? No documentation exists to answer these questions definitively, but the pattern of coverage suggests coordination. And the presence of media leaders at meetings where military and political figures discuss the intervention creates obvious potential for influence. For conspiracy theorists, this is exactly how elite coordination works, not through explicit direction but through shared perspectives cultivated in private forums. Media leaders attend Bilderberg, absorb elite consensus, and return to their outlets where that consensus shapes coverage, all without anyone explicitly coordinating or conspiring. For defenders, this interpretation conflates coincidence with causation. Media coverage reflected independent editorial judgment that happened to align with official positions. The fact that media executives attended Bilderberg is irrelevant to coverage decisions made by independent journalists following professional standards. But even the defense acknowledges the problem. If independent journalistic judgment happens to consistently align with elite positions, and if the journalists making those judgments are integrated into elite networks through forums like Bilderberg, then the independence becomes questionable, even if no explicit coordination occurs. This is the media paradox at its core. Either journalists at Bilderberg are influenced by their participation, in which case their independence is compromised, or they are not influenced, in which case their participation is pointless. But the claim that they gain valuable insight without any influence on their perspective is difficult to sustain, and so the paradox endures. The institutions meant to scrutinize power participate in power's private gatherings. The journalists meant to expose secrets keep secrets, and the media that should make Bilderberg transparent instead maintain the opacity that allows the meeting to continue year after year, outside public view. Chapter 8. The Protest Era. For most of its existence, Bilderberg operated in near-total obscurity. The public knew little. The media reported less. The meetings occurred year after year without significant attention or protest. This was precisely how organisers wanted it. Privacy protected by obscurity. That began to change in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The internet enabled conspiracy theorists to share information and coordinate responses. Alternative media outlets began covering Bilderberg extensively. Investigative researchers started tracking attendance and documenting connections, and activists started showing up. The 2005 meeting in Rottach-Egern, Germany, was surrounded by protesters for the first time in significant numbers. They held signs demanding transparency. They chanted slogans about democracy and accountability. They framed their demonstration not as opposition to dialogue between nations, but as insistence that such dialogue should not occur in secrecy when it involves people who hold democratic office or seek to influence democratic processes. The protesters' message was consistent. If Bilderberg is merely a discussion forum with no decision-making power, why the extreme security? If no binding agreements are made, why the absolute prohibition on recording? If the meetings are innocent, why the insistence on secrecy? Bilderberg organisers responded through official statements that privacy is essential for candid discussion. That transparency would transform the gathering into a media spectacle, where participants would grandstand rather than engage honestly. That the value of the meeting lies precisely in its informal, off-the-record nature. But the protests continued and intensified. 2009 in Vuligmeni, Greece. 2012 in Chantilly, Virginia, the first time Bilderberg met in the United States, bringing protesters to American soil. 2015 in Telfsbuchen, Austria, where hundreds of demonstrators gathered outside the heavily secured Interalpen Hotel. Each year, activists assembled outside luxury hotels demanding accountability. The protesters represented diverse ideological backgrounds, some from the political left, concerned about corporate power, some from the libertarian right, concerned about globalist governance, some from neither traditional political camp, simply insisting on democratic transparency. What changed was not the meetings themselves. The format remained identical, but public awareness. Bilderberg could no longer operate in comfortable anonymity. The existence of the gathering became widely known. The guest list began to be leaked or officially released in advance, though still incomplete. Media coverage increased, though it remained predominantly dismissive. This dismissiveness itself became part of the controversy. Mainstream media coverage of Bilderberg protests typically framed demonstrators as paranoid conspiracists, rather than engaged citizens exercising democratic rights. Articles emphasized the more extreme theories that circulated in some activist circles, claims about world government, Illuminati connections, population control schemes, while ignoring substantive concerns about undemocratic elite coordination. Why, protesters asked, were demands for transparency treated as irrational? Why was skepticism about private meetings of powerful figures characterized as delusion? Why was the burden of proof placed on critics rather than on the secretive organization itself? The establishment response was predictable. Conspiracy theorists see patterns where none exist. They attribute coordination to coincidence. They mistake informal networking for formal planning. And their demands for transparency reflect misunderstanding of how international relations and policy development actually function. This response, protesters argued, misses the point entirely. Even if no explicit conspiracy exists, the structure itself remains troubling. When democracy's most powerful figures meet outside democratic processes, when decisions that affect millions are discussed without public input, when the only accountability mechanism is the participant's own discretion, skepticism seems not just reasonable, but necessary. The 2013 meeting in Watford, England, saw particularly large protests. The gathering occurred during the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, when public anger at financial and political elites was especially intense. Protesters framed Bilderberg as symbolic of the disconnect between democratic institutions and actual power, a gathering where the people responsible for the crisis could meet privately, while ordinary citizens suffered the consequences. Security at that meeting was extraordinary. Police established wide perimeters. Roads were closed. Airspace was restricted. The Grove Hotel, a luxury resort, became a fortress. Protesters were kept at significant distance, unable to even see the venue clearly, much less approach it. This level of security prompted its own questions. British police resources were stretched during austerity. Public services were being cut. Yet here were substantial police resources dedicated to protecting a private meeting that supposedly had no official status. Who paid for that security? The meeting organisers provided some funding, but British taxpayers subsidised much of it. Why should public resources protect private gatherings of wealthy elites? And if the meeting truly was just discussion with no decisions being made, why did it require security measures typically reserved for heads of state during wartime? These practical questions resonated beyond conspiracy theory communities. Even people sceptical of elaborate conspiracy theories could see the contradiction. Public resources protecting private power. Democratic institutions serving undemocratic processes. Transparency demanded of citizens while elites met in secret. The protest also revealed interesting dynamics among demonstrators themselves. Some were well-informed activists who focused on documented facts about attendees and their policy positions. Others promoted more speculative theories, and the media typically emphasised the latter, while ignoring the former. This created a catch-22 for critics. The most extreme theories attracted media attention but discredited legitimate concerns. The most substantive critiques were ignored by media but failed to attract public attention, and media coverage itself was compromised by the fact that media executives attended the very meetings being protested. By the mid-2010s, Bilderberg had become a symbol. For some, it represented necessary informal diplomacy in a complex world. For others, it exemplified everything wrong with contemporary democracy, the subordination of democratic processes to elite interests, the operation of power outside public accountability, the transformation of citizenship from participation to spectatorship. The 2016 meeting in Dresden, Germany, occurred shortly before the Brexit referendum and during the US presidential primary season. Both events represented populist challenges to established elites. Both would produce outcomes that shocked observers who assumed elite preferences would prevail. Protesters in Dresden argued that events like Brexit and Trump's rise were partly responses to exactly the kind of elite coordination Bilderberg represented. When ordinary citizens feel that decisions are made without their input, when they perceive that elites operate in their own interests rather than public good, when they see institutions of power meeting in secret, they rebel. Whether this analysis was correct is debatable, but it was plausible, and the fact that it was plausible illustrated how Bilderberg, regardless of its actual influence, had become symbolic of broader concerns about democracy, accountability, and power. The protests continue. Each year, activists gather. Each year, they demand transparency. Each year, they are dismissed as conspiracists by the same media whose executives attend the meetings. And each year, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Not because there are no answers, but because the structure ensures that answers are never required. Privacy is maintained, secrecy is protected, and power continues to meet outside public view, year after year, discussion after discussion, network after network. Chapter 9. The Policy Shadow Theory. The most sophisticated version of the Bilderberg conspiracy theory does not claim that specific decisions are made at the meetings. It does not allege that votes are taken or agreements signed. Instead, it proposes something more subtle and more difficult to disprove, that Bilderberg shapes policy consensus before public debate begins. Here is how the theory works. Political leaders, journalists, corporate executives, and policy experts meet privately for 3 days. They discuss challenges facing their nations and the global system. Through extended conversation, over formal sessions, working meals, evening receptions, and informal encounters, a general approach begins to emerge. Not through formal resolution, but through the natural process of intelligent people influencing each other's thinking. This consensus is not explicit. No one announces it, no document records it. But participants leave with shared understanding of challenges and appropriate responses. They have heard the same analyses, they have absorbed the same frameworks, they have developed relationships that will persist after the meeting concludes. When these individuals return to their respective positions, they carry this shared understanding with them. The politicians propose policies that reflect the consensus. The journalists frame those policies in ways that legitimate them. The corporate leaders align their strategies accordingly. The policy experts provide supporting research that appears independent, but actually reinforces what was already decided privately. To the public, these developments appear to emerge organically. Politicians cite evidence, journalists report objectively, experts offer independent analysis, public debate occurs, democratic processes unfold. But the underlying consensus was formed, privately, before any public discussion occurred. The range of acceptable policy options was defined in closed rooms. The terms of debate were established by people who were never elected to establish them, and by the time the public engages with the issues, the trajectory has already been set. This version of the theory is difficult to challenge because it does not require proof of explicit coordination. It simply observes that when influential people meet privately and then pursue similar agendas, the influence is real, even if no conspiracy exists in the traditional sense. Consider the expansion of the European Union in the early 2000s. For years, Bilderberg meetings had included discussions of European integration. Attendees included EU officials, politicians from candidate countries, and corporate leaders interested in expanded markets. The benefits of expansion were extensively debated in those private sessions. Arguments were refined, counter-arguments were addressed. By the time public campaigns began in candidate countries, the case for EU membership had been thoroughly developed by people who would go on to advocate for it publicly. When expansion occurred, it was presented as the result of democratic processes within each nation. Referendums were held, parliamentary debates occurred, citizens were told they were making independent choices. But conspiracy theorists asked, how independent were those choices if the political leaders advocating for expansion, the media outlets covering the debate, and the business community's funding campaigns had all participated in private discussions where the benefits of expansion had been extensively debated and a consensus favourable to expansion had already formed? The public debate became a formality. The decision had been made, not through explicit vote, but through private consensus formation that preceded and shaped democratic processes. The same pattern appears in debates over financial regulation, trade, agreements, and military interventions. By the time the public debate begins, the positions of powerful actors have already been coordinated, not through conspiracy, but through the more mundane mechanism of shared private discussions among people who already broadly agree and whose interests largely align. This is the policy shadow theory, not a conspiracy of smoke-filled rooms and secret handshakes, but a structural reality in which power operates through informal networks that precede and shape formal democratic processes. The Iraq War provides a stark example. In the years preceding the 2003 invasion, Bilderberg meetings included extensive discussions of Middle East policy. Attendees included defense officials, intelligence figures, and neoconservative intellectuals who advocated regime change in Iraq. The arguments for intervention were developed and refined in those private discussions. The intelligence assessments that would later be used to justify war were previewed. The strategic rationale was debated. The media narratives that would build public support were explored. When the public debate finally began, the positions were already established. Political leaders in multiple countries advanced similar arguments. Intelligence services in different nations produced compatible assessments. Media outlets framed the issues in complementary ways, and before long, intervention that might have seemed unlikely became inevitable. Was this coordination? In the explicit sense, probably not. No one at Bilderberg voted to invade Iraq. No formal agreement was reached. No conspiracy was hatched, but consensus was formed. People who would go on to shape policy, influence media coverage, and define public debate absorbed shared frameworks and private discussions. And when they returned to their positions of power, that shared framework manifested as coordinated action, not because anyone directed it, but because the participants had been aligned through informal process. This is how elite coordination actually works in modern democracies, not through crude conspiracies but through sophisticated consensus formation, not through explicit direction but through shared assumptions, not through documents and votes but through relationships and networks. The policy shadow theory suggests that for every major policy decision, there is a shadow process where the real work of consensus formation occurs. This shadow process happens at forums like Bilderberg, where elites meet outside democratic accountability. By the time formal democratic processes begin, the shadow work is complete. The range of acceptable options has been defined. The terms of debate have been established. Democracy becomes theatre. Citizens are allowed to choose, but only among options that were pre-selected by elites. Public debate occurs, but within boundaries that were defined privately. And the appearance of democratic decision-making masks the reality of elite coordination. This theory explains patterns that would otherwise seem inexplicable. How do policies in multiple countries shift in coordinated fashion without formal agreements? How do media outlets across different nations adopt similar framing simultaneously? How do academic experts produce research that consistently supports elite positions? The answer: because the people making these decisions participate in forums where consensus is quietly cultivated. They attend the same conferences, they join the same networks, they absorb the same assumptions, and they return to their diverse positions where they implement that consensus as though it emerged independently. Whether this constitutes a genuine threat to democracy, or simply reflects how complex governance necessarily functions, is a question with no clear answer. But the fact that the question itself is rarely discussed in mainstream forums might be the most telling aspect of all. Because if the policy shadow theory is correct, then one of the things determined in those shadow processes is which questions can be asked in public forums, and questions about the shadow process itself would naturally be excluded, not through censorship, but through the shared assumption among elites that such questions are inappropriate, conspiratorial, or simply not serious. This creates a self-reinforcing system. Elite coordination produces policies. Those policies are legitimated through democratic theatre. Questions about the coordination process are dismissed as conspiracy theory, and the cycle continues, with power operating through networks that are never acknowledged, never scrutinised, and never challenged. The policy shadow is real. The only question is whether it serves public interest or elite interest, and whether the two can be meaningfully distinguished. Chapter 10. Why no records exist. Every year, after each Bilderberg meeting concludes, the same question resurfaces: why are no minutes published? It's not merely that minutes are kept private. It's that they are not kept at all. No official record is created. No transcript is produced. No summary is distributed even to participants. The discussions simply occur and then vanish, preserved only in the memories of attendees and whatever notes they might take for personal use. The official answer has remained consistent for 70 years. The Chatham House rule exists to protect candid discussion. If participants knew their specific statements would be documented and published, they would be less willing to share honest assessments or explore controversial ideas. The value of Bilderberg lies in its informality, and documentation would destroy that informality. This reasoning is not without merit. People do speak more freely when they know their words won't be recorded for posterity. Difficult conversations become possible when participants trust that positions explored today won't be weaponized tomorrow. Genuine dialogue requires some protection from political consequences. But critics offer a different interpretation. The absence of records ensures deniability. If no documentation exists, then claims about what was discussed can be neither proven nor disproven. Participants can selectively share what they learned without fear of contradiction. And if policies later implemented seem to align with discussions held at Bilderberg, the connection can always be dismissed as speculation. This deniability serves multiple purposes. It protects participants from accusations of impropriety. It shields the organisation from allegations of undue influence. And it allows democracy to proceed as if decisions are being made through transparent processes, even when the groundwork was laid in private. Consider what records would reveal. If minutes existed, we could verify whether specific policies were discussed before being publicly proposed. We could see who advocated for particular positions. We could trace the evolution of consensus on contentious issues. We could identify patterns of influence and coordination. In other words, we could hold participants accountable. We could assess whether their public positions align with their private advocacy. We could determine whether policies serve public interest or private interests of meeting attendees. The absence of records makes such accountability impossible. A politician can discuss policy privately with corporate executives whose industries would benefit from that policy, then implement it while claiming to serve public interest. A journalist can receive briefings from intelligence officials, then report on security threats without disclosing the source of their information. A central banker can coordinate with financial executives about monetary policy, then implement policies that benefit those executives while claiming independent judgment. None of this can be proven, because no record exists. This is not an accident. It is the fundamental design of Bilderberg. The organisation is structured specifically to enable influence without accountability, coordination without documentation, power without fingerprints. The conspiracy theory, at its core, is not about what happens at Bilderberg. It is about what cannot be proven to have happened. It is about the space created by the absence of records, a space where influence can operate without accountability, where power can be exercised without documentation, where democracy's most fundamental requirement of transparency is deliberately suspended. Some defend this arrangement. They argue that not every conversation needs to be public, that informal diplomacy serves valuable purposes, that complex problems require the kind of honest discussion that only occurs when participants are protected from immediate political consequences. These arguments have force. Governance is complicated. Sometimes officials need to explore ideas that would be politically toxic if publicly attributed. Sometimes consensus must be built through private conversation before public announcement becomes possible. Sometimes honest assessment requires protection from media distortion and political opportunism. But there is a difference between temporary confidentiality and permanent absence of records. Diplomatic negotiations are confidential during the process, but documented for historical record. Security discussions may be classified, but subject to eventual declassification. Political deliberations occur privately but produce documents that become available through freedom of information requests. Bilderberg is different. The absence of records is permanent. There is no eventual declassification. There is no historical archive. There is simply silence. Deliberate, permanent, absolute. This raises questions about motivation. If the discussions are merely exchange of ideas with no decisions being made, why permanent absence of documentation? If participants have nothing to hide, why structured deniability? If Bilderberg serves democracy by fostering understanding among leaders, why does it operate through mechanisms that prevent democratic accountability? The standard response is that privacy enables the kind of frank discussion that produces genuine understanding. That documentation would chill conversation and reduce Bilderberg to the same kind of performative dialogue that characterizes public forums. But this response assumes that democratic accountability and honest conversation are incompatible. It assumes that leaders cannot speak truthfully if they know their words will be subject to scrutiny. It assumes that governance requires spaces protected from democratic oversight. These are troubling assumptions. They suggest that democracy is incompatible with effective governance, that the people who hold power cannot serve the public interest if the public is watching, that accountability itself is an obstacle to good governance rather than its foundation, and, if these assumptions are correct, then democracy is fundamentally flawed. Because how can a system where leaders must hide from accountability to govern effectively be called democratic? This is the deepest challenge Bilderberg poses, not merely the question of what happens at the meetings, but the question of what it means that such meetings exist at all. The structure itself, powerful figures meeting in permanent secrecy, represents a challenge to democratic theory. Because democracy, in theory, rests on transparency and accountability. Leaders are supposed to be accountable to citizens. Decisions are supposed to be made through open processes. Power is supposed to be exercised under public scrutiny. But Bilderberg operates on exactly the opposite principles. Leaders meet outside public view. Decisions, or at least consensus formation, occurs through closed processes. Power is exercised specifically through protection from public scrutiny. This is not an aberration. It is not a temporary expedient. It is a permanent institution, meeting annually for 70 years, with no indication of ever becoming more transparent. And so the absence of records is not merely a practical decision about how to run effective meetings. It is a statement about the nature of power itself. It says that power, at its highest levels, does not owe accountability to those it governs, that leaders require protection from scrutiny to function effectively, that democracy is a public performance while real decisions occur elsewhere. Whether this statement is accurate is debatable, but that Bilderberg operates according to these principles is not. The absence of records ensures this will never change, because without documentation there can be no historical reckoning. Future researchers cannot assess what actually happened. Citizens cannot evaluate whether their leaders served public or private interests. Democracy cannot learn from experience because the experience is deliberately not recorded. This is perhaps the most troubling aspect of all. Bilderberg does not merely influence the present, it erases the ability to understand the past. It ensures that historical judgment of this period will always be incomplete, because the forums where powerful people met and coordinated will leave no trace. Democracy requires memory. It requires the ability to look back, assess decisions, hold leaders accountable to history if not to contemporary publics. But Bilderberg prevents this. By leaving no records, it ensures that this form of power will never be fully understood, never be completely scrutinized, never be held accountable, even to history. And that absence, permanent, deliberate, absolute, might be the truest indication of what Bilderberg actually is. Not a discussion forum, not informal diplomacy, but a mechanism for elite coordination designed specifically to operate outside any form of accountability, whether democratic or historical. The meetings continue, the minutes are never published, and power operates in permanent shadows, leaving no evidence but its effects. Epilogue. Power behind closed doors. Each year, in early spring or early summer, the process repeats with mechanical precision. Invitations are sent to approximately 150 individuals across Western democracies. Arrangements are made at luxury hotels or secluded resorts. Security is established by a combination of private contractors and local police. Media is warned to keep distance. And for 3 days, the world's most powerful people gather in a location that has been cleared of everyone else. Motorcades arrive quietly, often at night. Attendees enter through secured entrances shielded from cameras. Doors close, security perimeters are established, and for 72 hours discussions occur that the public will never hear, in rooms that will never be described, about topics that will never be fully disclosed. The format has not changed in 70 years. Morning sessions address economic matters. Afternoon sessions focus on security and political questions. Evening receptions allow for relationship building. Throughout, the Chatham House rule governs. Information may be used, but sources cannot be attributed. When the meeting concludes, the attendees depart as quietly as they arrived. They return to their positions of influence. Political offices, corporate boardrooms, media platforms, academic institutions, financial centres. They make decisions, they shape policies, they influence the flow of information, and life continues. For most people, nothing changes. They go about their daily lives unaware that such meetings occur. They read newspapers and watch broadcasts and participate in democratic processes, believing that the decisions affecting their lives are made through transparent mechanisms governed by public accountability. But for those who know about Bilderberg, a question lingers, not a question that can be answered with evidence or disproven with facts, but a question about the nature of power itself. When influence meets in private, when the powerful coordinate outside public view, when democracy's most important figures gather without democratic oversight, what decisions are shaped before citizens are even aware that a decision needs to be made? The conspiracy theory of Bilderberg is not primarily about secret plans or sinister plots. It is about structural power. It is about the ways that influence operates through networks that precede and shape the formal mechanisms of governance. It is about the possibility that democracy, as we understand it, might be more theatre than reality, with the real decisions made elsewhere, by people whose discussions we will never access, and whose influence we can never fully measure. This is why Bilderberg endures as a subject of speculation and concern, not because of what can be proven, but because of what cannot. Not because of the evidence of conspiracy, but because of the absence of evidence for anything else. In the end, the most unsettling aspect of Bilderberg is not the meeting itself. It is the reminder that power, at its highest levels, operates in ways that remain fundamentally opaque to those it affects most. That the people who shape our world might be doing so through conversations we will never hear, in rooms we will never enter, guided by considerations we will never fully understand. Each year, the same questions arise. Why the secrecy if nothing improper occurs? Why the security if no decisions are made? Why the permanent absence of records if transparency poses no threat? And each year, the questions go unanswered. Not because answers don't exist, but because the structure ensures answers are never required. Bilderberg represents something deeper than any specific conspiracy theory suggests. It represents the institutionalization of elite coordination outside democratic processes. It represents the acceptance that power operates most effectively when protected from accountability. It represents the triumph of private influence over public oversight. Whether this is necessary pragmatism or dangerous oligarchy cannot be definitively determined. But what is certain is that it represents a challenge to democratic theory that has never been adequately addressed. How can democracy function when its most powerful figures meet regularly in secret? How can citizens make informed decisions when elite consensus is formed privately before public debate begins? How can accountability exist when the forums where power coordinates leave no trace? These are not idle philosophical questions. They are practical challenges to the functioning of democratic societies. And Bilderberg, by existing, by persisting, by maintaining absolute privacy year after year, demonstrates that these challenges have not been resolved. The meeting continues, the minutes are never published, and the question of what happens when the world's elites gather in private remains, as it has for 70 years, a matter of interpretation rather than documentation. Perhaps that is exactly how it was designed to be, a structure that enables power to coordinate while preventing verification, a network that shapes policy while leaving no evidence, an institution that influences democracy while existing outside democratic accountability. And each year, when the motorcades depart and the hotels return to normal operation, and the attendees resume their public lives, that opacity remains. A permanent feature of how power functions, a reminder that some doors stay closed no matter how loudly we knock. The protesters gather and leave. The conspiracy theories circulate and evolve, the academic defenders explain and rationalise. But the meetings continue, unchanged and unaccountable. Because in the end, Bilderberg is not about what happens in those closed rooms. It is about what the existence of those closed rooms means for democracy itself. It means that power operates on levels citizens cannot access. It means that decisions are shaped through processes they cannot observe. It means that accountability has limits that protect the powerful while constraining everyone else. And it means that somewhere, right now, plans are being made that will affect your life. Policies are being discussed that will determine your opportunities. Consensus is being formed that will define your possibilities. And you will never know who said what. You will never see the evidence they considered. You will never understand the interests that shape their thinking. You will simply wake up one day to find that something has changed. A policy has shifted. A priority has emerged. A direction has been set. And by the time you notice, the conversation that produced it will have concluded months or years earlier, in rooms you cannot enter, among people you cannot question, through processes you cannot observe. This is Bilderberg. This is how power functions at the highest levels. This is the reality behind democratic facades. The meeting without minutes, the gathering that shapes the world while leaving no trace, the institution that proves year after year that when it comes to real power, transparency is optional and accountability is negotiable. And perhaps most troubling of all, this is not an exception. It is not an aberration. It is not a temporary measure or an emergency expedient. It is how things work, how they have worked for 70 years, how they will continue to work in all likelihood for decades to come, because power protects itself. And the first rule of power is to operate where scrutiny cannot reach. The motorcades will arrive again next year. The doors will close. The discussions will occur. And the rest of us will continue believing in the democracy we are shown, never seeing the power that operates behind closed doors. Before we begin tonight's investigation, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the unexplained. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from around the globe, and a special thanks to Justin for suggesting this story. Now, let's get into it. Intro. The Discovery. December 2020. National Archives, College Park, Maryland. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar drone as Laura Benton wheeled another cart of Cold War materials into the processing room. After 16 years as an archivist, she'd developed a rhythm: log the box number, check the inventory list, remove each item, photograph, digitize, refile, repeat. She'd processed thousands of documents this way: missile telemetry data, reconnaissance photographs, strategic planning memos, the bureaucratic detritus of the nuclear age, now declassified and catalogued for researchers who would probably never look at most of it. Box CW-4789L contained film reels from Johnston Atoll, the remote Pacific island that had served as a launch site for high-altitude nuclear tests in the early 1960s. Laura had processed dozens of similar boxes: launch footage, tracking data, atmospheric readings, nothing unusual. She pulled out the third canister and noticed the label was handwritten rather than typed. That was odd, but not unprecedented. Field personnel often labelled reels on site before sending them back to archives. The label read, USF Tracking Reel, Johnston Island, July 1962. Do not duplicate. Laura made a note of the restriction. Probably contained classified camera angles or revealed equipment specifications that were still sensitive even after all these years. She'd seen similar warnings before. She set up the projector, threaded the film with practiced hands and dimmed the lights. The screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, black and white, shot from what appeared to be a ground-based camera tracking the sky. Time code ran along the bottom edge. July 9th, 1962. 0900 hours, Zulu time. Starfish Prime. The most powerful nuclear weapon ever detonated in space. 1.4 megatons at an altitude of 250 miles above the Pacific Ocean. Laura had seen footage of Starfish Prime before. It was one of the most documented nuclear tests in history. The detonation had knocked out streetlights in Hawaii, disrupted radio communications across the Pacific, and created artificial auroras visible from Hawaii to New Zealand. The countdown proceeded in silence. Film reels from this era rarely included audio. She watched the sky, waiting for the flash. And then it came. The screen went white. The nuclear fireball expanded, a perfect sphere of light against the darkness of space. The camera's exposure struggled to compensate, creating that familiar bloom effect around the detonation point. Laura had watched this sequence dozens of times in other footage. She knew what came next. The fireball would fade, the camera would readjust, the sky would return to black. But in that half second before the exposure corrected, she saw something else. A shape, a curve, an arc. She stopped the projector, rewound 10 frames, advanced slowly, frame by frame. There. The nuclear flash had illuminated something above the detonation point. Something massive. Something that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't clouds. The curvature was too regular, too precise. It wasn't aurora. The edges were too defined. It wasn't an artifact of the film. The shape remained consistent across multiple frames, with three-dimensional depth and shadow. It was a structure. Laura felt her pulse quicken. She advanced the film frame by frame, studying the shape. It appeared to be an arc, like a section of an enormous dome, positioned above the Earth's atmosphere. The nuclear flash had backlit it for just a fraction of a second, long enough for the camera to capture its outline against the void of space. She checked the timecode again. This footage was taken from Johnston Island, which meant the camera was looking northwest toward the detonation point. The structure appeared to be between the camera and the blast, which meant it was somewhere in the upper atmosphere or low orbit. But that was impossible. There were no structures in orbit in 1962. The first American satellite had launched just 4 years earlier. The International Space Station wouldn't exist for another 4 decades. In July of '62, humanity had barely managed to put a man in orbit. So what was this? Laura rewound the film and played it again. The structure was still there, solid, unmoving, massive enough to be visible from hundreds of miles away. She needed to document this. She switched on the digitization equipment and began capturing the frames. The old projector clacked and whirred as the film advanced through the scanner. Each frame converted to a digital file stored on the archive's internal network. She was halfway through the scan when the door opened. Laura looked up. 2 men stood in the doorway, dark suits, no ties. One was older, grey-haired, with the kind of weathered face that suggested a career spent outdoors. The other was younger, maybe mid-30s, with the alert posture of someone trained to move quickly. Neither of them wore identification badges. "Miss Benton," the older man said. Not a question, a statement. He knew her name. "Can I help you?" Laura asked, her hand instinctively moving toward the phone on her desk. The younger man moved to the projector with practiced efficiency. He didn't ask permission. He simply unplugged the power, cord, and began removing the film reel. "Hey, wait," Laura said, standing. "That's archive property. You can't just—" "You're done for the day, Miss Benton," the older man said. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried absolute authority. "Please gather your personal items and come with us." "I don't understand. Who are you?" "We're escorting you out. That's all you need to know." The younger man had already secured the film reel in a metal case he had brought with him. He unplugged her computer workstation without shutting it down. The screen went black mid-scan. "I need to log this properly," Laura protested. "There are procedures." "The procedures have changed," the older man said. "Come with us. Now." Something in his tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Laura grabbed her purse, her mind racing. She hadn't done anything wrong. This was declassified material. She was following standard archival protocols, but these men didn't seem to care about protocols. They walked her through the archive building in silence. Other staff members glanced up from their work, then quickly looked away. The older man held her arm gently but firmly, the kind of grip that communicated control without causing pain. They escorted her to the parking lot. Her car sat in its usual spot, illuminated by the late afternoon sun. The older man released her arm. "Go home, Miss Benton," he said. "Forget what you saw. Consider it classified retroactively." "I don't... Go home." Laura got in her car. Her hands were shaking. She sat there for 20 minutes, watching the archive building in her rearview mirror, trying to process what had just happened. She'd been processing declassified materials, public record. Anyone with a researcher card could request access to those files. So why had two men in suits just confiscated a film reel that was supposed to be open to the public? And more importantly, what was that structure in the footage? That night, sitting at her home computer, Laura went through her archive access logs. The digitization had been interrupted, but the first few frames had already uploaded to the network before the men arrived. She found one frame, just one, the clearest shot of the structure, captured at the exact moment when the nuclear flash provided maximum illumination. She saved it to a USB drive. Then she deleted it from the network. Laura knew aerospace historians. She'd worked with dozens of them over the years, helping them navigate the archive's classified materials. One name came to mind: Evan Mercer. He'd written extensively about Cold War programs and had a reputation for taking strange leads seriously. She composed an email, short, simple, attached the image. "Do you know what this could be?" She hit send. 2 days later, Laura Benton's phone went straight to voicemail. Her apartment stood empty, the door locked, her car still parked in its assigned space. The National Archives received her resignation, letter via email, effective immediately, with no forwarding address. Her supervisor tried calling her emergency contacts. Her parents hadn't heard from her. Her sister didn't know where she'd gone. Nobody at the archive knew anything except that two men in suits had escorted her out on Tuesday afternoon. The film reel from box CW-4789L was logged as lost in processing. Equipment failure. A common occurrence with old reels. Nothing suspicious. But in Ohio, Evan Mercer opened an email from an archivist he'd worked with 3 years ago on a book about spy satellites. He clicked the attachment and stared at the image on his screen. A nuclear detonation. A flash. And behind it, illuminated for just a fraction of a second, something that shouldn't exist. Evan zoomed in on the image, studying the curve of the structure, the way the light fell on its surface, the shadows that suggested depth and dimension. Then he picked up his phone and started making calls. He didn't know it yet, but he'd just inherited the most dangerous investigation of his career, and somewhere in Maryland, Laura Benton's empty apartment was being thoroughly cleaned by people who didn't exist in any government database. Chapter 1. The Impossible Tests. Evan Mercer's office occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse in Columbus, Ohio. 3 rooms filled with filing cabinets, reference books, and boxes of declassified documents he'd accumulated over 15 years of research. His specialty was Cold War aerospace programs, the classified projects that pushed the boundaries of what humanity thought possible during the nuclear age. He'd written 3 books, the first on the Corona Spy satellite program, the second on early missile defense concepts, the third on Project West Ford, an attempt to create an artificial radiation belt using millions of copper needles in orbit, all of them based on painstaking research through declassified archives, FOIA requests, and interviews with retired military and scientific personnel. The image Laura Benton had sent him didn't fit anything he'd researched before. He printed it out, pinned it to his wall, stared at it for an hour. Then he went to his filing cabinets and pulled every folder related to high-altitude nuclear testing. Operation Fishbowl. He knew the basic history. Part of the larger Operation Dominic series in 1962, Fishbowl had conducted multiple nuclear detonations in the upper atmosphere and low orbit. The stated purpose was to study EMP effects and radiation belt responses. The test had created spectacular visual displays, but had also disrupted satellite operations and radio communications across the Pacific. Evans spread out the official test data on his desk. Launch dates, yield specifications, detonation altitudes, camera locations, all meticulously documented in the declassified reports. But he'd learned over the years that what wasn't in the reports often mattered, more than what was. He started with Operation Argus, August through September 1958. 4 years before Fishbowl, 3 nuclear detonations in the Van Allen radiation belts, conducted from Navy ships in the South Atlantic. Argus had remained classified for 24 years. The public didn't learn about it until 1982, when the government finally declassified the mission. That unusually long classification period had always interested Evan. Most nuclear tests were declassified within a decade. Argus stayed secret for nearly a quarter century. He'd obtained the Argus technical reports years ago for his Project Westford book. He pulled them out now and read them with fresh eyes. The language was peculiar. Evaluate radiative responses in artificial belt structures. Mapping of containment boundaries at high altitude. Measurement of artificial barrier fluctuations under nuclear loading. Evan circled those phrases. Containment boundaries, artificial barrier, nuclear loading. He'd read hundreds of nuclear test reports. This terminology was unique to Argus. Other tests talked about yield measurements, fallout patterns, atmospheric effects. They used standard nuclear weapons terminology, but Argus used the language of testing barriers, of measuring responses, of evaluating containment, as if they weren't testing weapons at all, as if they were testing something else. Evan made notes and moved on to Fishbowl. Operation Dominic, the umbrella program, conducted 43 nuclear tests throughout 1962. Fishbowl represented the high-altitude subset. The tests with exotic names, Bluegill Prime, Starfish Prime, Checkmate, Kingfish, Tightrope, detonations at altitudes ranging from 12 miles to over 200 miles. The official outcomes were well documented. Starfish Prime, the largest test, had been visible from Hawaii to New Zealand. The artificial auroras persisted for several minutes. The EMP knocked out streetlights in Honolulu, 900 miles from the detonation point. Radio communications across the Pacific were disrupted for hours. All expected effects from a 1.4 megaton detonation at high altitude. But Evan found anomalies in the technical appendices. An Air Force tracking station report mentioned unexpected shockwave reflections detected by multiple radar installations. A Navy camera operations log noted persistent equipment anomalies requiring calibration review after Bluegill Prime. A Los Alamos radiation measurement summary referenced secondary energy returns inconsistent with atmospheric models. These weren't headline findings. They were buried in footnotes and appendices, the kind of technical minutiae that most researchers skipped over. But Evan had learned to pay attention to footnotes. That's where the interesting questions lived. He cross-referenced the radar reports. 3 separate installations had detected the anomalous reflections. All at approximately the same altitude, right around 200 miles above Earth's surface, the same altitude where Laura's photograph showed the structure. Evan pulled the personnel files next. Fishbowl had involved dozens of scientists and military officers, but 2 names appeared repeatedly in the documentation. John Wolfe, radiation belt specialist, Princeton graduate. He'd published extensively on Van Allen belt physics before Fishbowl, then abruptly shifted his research focus afterward. No more papers on radiation belts. Instead, he'd moved into general plasma physics, never directly addressing high-altitude phenomena again. John Craven, Navy officer, project officer for Argus, technical advisor for Fishbowl, career military man with top-level security clearances. After Fishbowl, he'd moved to classified submarine programs and never spoke publicly about the nuclear tests. Both men had left behind personal notes in their archived papers. Evan had obtained copies years ago. He read them again now. Wolf's notes from June 1962, just before Bluegill Prime. Preliminary models suggest behaviour inconsistent with known magnetospheric responses. Need higher altitude detonation for confirmation. Craven's notes from July, right after Starfish Prime. Results exceed expectations. Further testing may be inadvisable. Recommend consultation with theoretical physics group. Inadvisable. That word stuck with Evan. Nuclear tests were massive government operations involving thousands of personnel and millions of dollars. You didn't call them inadvisable unless something had gone seriously wrong, or seriously unexpected. Evan looked at the test schedule. Fishbowl had been planned to continue through November. Multiple additional tests at various altitudes. But after Starfish Prime in July, the testing pace changed. Delays, equipment failures, modified flight plans. Bluegill Prime in June had failed, the missile detonating early at around 30 miles altitude. Bluegill Double Prime in July had failed, exploding on the launch pad. Starfish Prime succeeded in July, detonating at 250 miles. Bluegill Triple Prime in October succeeded at 30 miles. Checkmate in October failed, detonating early. Kingfish in November succeeded at 60 miles. The pattern was revealing. The only high-altitude test that worked was Starfish Prime. Everything after that stayed below 100 miles, and half of those tests failed, as if something was stopping them from going higher. Evan made a timeline on his whiteboard. Argus in 58, 4 years of apparent analysis, then Fishbowl in 62, focusing on even higher altitudes, one successful high-altitude test, then a sudden shift to lower altitudes and multiple failures. He stepped back and looked at the timeline. It looked less like a testing program and more like an escalation followed by a retreat, as if they'd tried something at high altitude and gotten a response they didn't expect. He needed to know what the scientists had been thinking before and after these tests. The official reports would be sanitized. But scientists kept personal correspondence. They shared preliminary findings with colleagues. They wrote conference papers and grant proposals. Evan started with James Van Allen. Van Allen had discovered the radiation belts in 1958 using data from the Explorer satellites. The belts bore his name. He was the world's foremost expert on near-Earth radiation environments. If anyone would understand what was happening during these high-altitude tests, it would be Van Allen. And Van Allen's public statements showed a curious pattern. Before Argus, he'd been vocal about the dangers of nuclear testing in space. He'd written op-eds calling the test reckless experimentation. He'd testified before Congress, warning that we didn't fully understand the radiation belts and shouldn't disturb them with nuclear weapons. Then Argus happened. After Argus, Van Allen went quiet for several months. No more op-eds, no more public warnings. When he finally spoke about high-altitude testing again, his position had shifted. By early 1962, just months before Fishbowl, Van Allen publicly supported the tests. He called them necessary for scientific understanding of near-Earth space environment. This was a complete reversal. Scientists changed their minds based on new evidence, certainly, but Van Allen's shift was abrupt and unexplained. He'd gone from calling the tests reckless to calling them necessary, with no public explanation of what had changed his mind. Evan had obtained Van Allen's archived correspondence from the University of Iowa years ago for background research. He'd skimmed through it then, looking for information about the Explorer satellites. Now he read it more carefully, focusing on the period between Argus and Fishbowl. Most of the letters were routine academic business, conference invitations, peer review requests, graduate student recommendations, but one letter, dated April 1962, stood out. It was addressed to a colleague at Los Alamos. The main body discussed a proposed symposium on space plasma physics. Standard stuff. But in the second paragraph, almost as an aside, Van Allen had written, "Our earlier assumptions about the belt's origins may require serious revision. I hesitate to discuss this in writing, but the implications of the Argus data suggest phenomena we hadn't considered. I hope we can discuss this in person at the symposium." Evan read that paragraph 5 times. Earlier assumptions about the belt's origins may require serious revision. Van Allen had discovered the radiation belts. He'd published the definitive papers on their structure and properties. Those belts were named after him. If he was saying the assumptions about their origins needed revision, that meant something fundamental had changed. Something he'd learned from Argus. Something he hesitated to discuss in writing. Evan picked up his phone and called the University of Iowa Physics Department. After several transfers, he reached the archivist responsible for Van Allen's papers. "I'm looking for any additional correspondence from Van Allen in 1962, Evan said, "particularly anything related to high-altitude nuclear testing." "We have the collection you already accessed," the archivist said. "That should include everything from that period." "Are there any restricted materials? Anything that wasn't released?" A pause. "There are some letters that were donated with restrictions. Family request. They won't be available until 2050. "What's in them?" "I can't discuss restricted materials, but I can tell you they're mostly personal correspondence, nothing scientific." "Did Van Allen write anything else about Argus or Fishbowl?" "Not in the unrestricted collection. He gave several talks about the tests, but those were general discussions. No technical details." Evan thanked her and hung up. Van Allen had been careful. Whatever he'd learned from Argus, whatever had made him change his position on high-altitude testing, he'd kept it out of his archived papers, but he'd changed his position for a reason. Evan looked at the photograph on his wall. The structure, the arc, the impossible object that shouldn't exist at 200 miles altitude in 1962. He thought about containment boundaries and artificial barriers, about scientists changing their positions, about tests that succeeded once and then failed repeatedly. And he realized something that made his chest tighten. What if Fishbowl wasn't a weapons test at all? What if it was an attempt to break through something? Chapter 2. The scientists who knew Evans spent the next 2 weeks filing Freedom of Information Act requests. He'd done this hundreds of times for his books and consulting work. The process was tedious but usually productive. Government agencies were required by law to respond, though they often heavily redacted sensitive information. He requested all documents related to high-altitude nuclear testing between 1958 and 1965. Radar tracking data from the Fishbowl tests, camera operation logs, radiation measurement reports, scientific analysis memos, anything that might explain the anomalies he'd found. The responses came back slowly. Most were heavily redacted, large sections blacked out, entire pages sometimes reduced to just the header and footer, everything else classified. But then he got lucky. One document came back completely unredacted, a Los Alamos National Laboratory internal memo that had been declassified in 1998 but never properly catalogued. The FOI processor had found it in a misfiled box and sent it without realizing it should have been reviewed for redactions. LA 273 Reflection Event Assessment, July 12th, 1962. Evan stared at the document header, July 12th, 3 days after Starfish Prime. The memo was 3 pages of dense technical language, radar measurements, energy calculations, spectral analysis. Most of it required a physics degree to fully understand, but the conclusion was written in plain English. The returning shock wave was not consistent with interaction with ionosphere or magnetosphere. Energy return suggests reflection from solid or semi-solid boundary at approximately 220 miles altitude. Further analysis terminated by directive. All personnel are to direct future inquiries to Project Officer. Signed by Darrell Froman, Deputy Director of Los Alamos National Laboratory during the 1960s, one of the top administrators in the entire nuclear weapons program. Evan read the conclusion again. Reflection from solid or semi-solid boundary. Not atmospheric effects, not radiation belt interactions, not measurement error, a boundary. something solid enough to reflect a nuclear shockwave, and analysis had been terminated by directive. Someone had ordered them to stop looking into this. Evan made copies of the memo and stored them in 3 different locations. This was the kind of document that had a tendency to disappear if the wrong people noticed it had been released. Then he started tracking down anyone who'd worked at Los Alamos during the fishbowl period. Most of the scientists were dead. Nuclear weapons research in the 1960s had involved a lot of radiation exposure, and many of the researchers hadn't lived to old age. The survivors were scattered across the country, mostly in retirement. Evan made dozens of calls. Many people refused to talk. Some claimed they didn't remember anything about fishbowl. A few hung up as soon as he mentioned high-altitude testing, but one person agreed to talk. On the condition of complete anonymity, Margaret Reeves, 83 years old, living in a retirement community in New Mexico. She'd been Darrell Froman's administrative assistant from 1960 through 1964. She remembered the memo. "That was a strange time," she said when Evan called. Her voice was thin but steady. "A lot of confusion after that big test in July, the one that made the lights go out in Hawaii." "Starfish Prime," Evan said. "That's the one. The data came back and nobody knew what to make of it. I heard the scientists arguing about it in the hallways. They kept saying the numbers didn't make sense." "What numbers?" "The measurements from the tracking stations. They were getting readings that shouldn't have been there, like echoes but from the wrong direction. One scientist said it was like the blast had hit a wall and bounced back." Evan felt his pulse quicken. "Did they figure out what caused it?" A long pause. Evan could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. "Miss Reeves?" "There was a structure," she finally said. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "That's why they stopped the tests." "What kind of structure?" "I don't know. I wasn't a scientist. I just heard them talking. They were scared. I'd never seen those men scared before. They'd built the atomic bomb. They'd watched hundreds of weapons tests. But after Starfish Prime, they were scared." "Did anyone say what the structure was?" "No. Mr. Froman called a meeting, closed door. When they came out, he told me to destroy all the analysis documents, everything related to the reflection event. He said it was being classified at a higher level." "But you remember the memo?" "I typed it before the classification order came down. That was the last official analysis they did. After that, everything went quiet." "Why did they stop?" Another long pause. "Miss Reeves, please, why did they stop the tests?" "Because they realised they weren't alone," she said quietly. "That's what Mr. Froman told me. He said humanity wasn't alone, and we just tried to attack something we didn't understand. He told me to forget everything I'd seen, for my own safety." "Did he say who built the structure?" "No, he wouldn't talk about it after that. None of them would. It was like a wall of silence came down. Even the scientists who'd been arguing in the hallways stopped discussing it. Someone put pressure on them, high-level pressure." Evan had more questions, but Margaret ended the call. She'd said too much already. She knew it. He could hear the fear in her voice. He sat in his office staring at his notes. A structure, reflection signatures, scientists who'd been scared, analysis terminated by directive. This wasn't a measurement error, it wasn't atmospheric anomaly. They detected something real, something solid, something that reflected a nuclear shockwave back to Earth. And someone had ordered them to stop investigating it. Evan pulled up the footage from the other fishbowl tests. He'd obtained copies of the declassified camera recordings years ago. He'd watched them before, but casually, just getting a sense of what high-altitude nuclear tests looked like. Now he watched them systematically, looking for anomalies. Bluegill Prime, June. The missile had launched successfully but experienced an electrical failure at 30 miles altitude. The warhead detonated early. The official report blamed component malfunction. But Evan noticed something in the telemetry data. The failure occurred at exactly 29.7 miles. The missile systems had been functioning normally up to that point. Then multiple electrical systems failed simultaneously. Not a single component. Multiple systems, all at once. At a specific altitude, Bluegill Double Prime, July. The missile never left the launch pad. Electrical failure during the countdown sequence. The warhead was damaged and had to be recovered. The official report blamed wiring issues, but Evan noticed the countdown had proceeded normally until the moment of ignition. Then the entire missile's electrical system shut down. Not a fuel problem, not a mechanical failure. Electrical systems failure. Same as Bluegill Prime, Starfish Prime, July 9th. Successful launch. Successful detonation at 250 miles. The only completely successful high-altitude test in the entire Fishbowl program. And that was when Laura's photograph showed the structure. After Starfish Prime, the program changed. No more 200-mile altitude tests. Everything dropped to under 100 miles. Bluegill Triple Prime, October. Successful detonation at 30 miles. Checkmate, October. Another electrical failure. Detonation at 60 miles, well below the planned altitude of 140 miles. Kingfish, November. Successful detonation at 60 miles, but the warhead yield was only half what it should have been. The official report blamed weapons design issues. Evan made a chart. He plotted altitude against test success rate. Below 50 miles, high success rate. 50 to 100 miles, mixed results. Above 100 miles, only one success, followed by multiple failures. The pattern was clear. Something was interfering with the tests at high altitude. Not mechanical problems, not design flaws. Something external, as if something was stopping them from going higher. Evan thought about the structure in Laura's photograph. The massive arc. The defined edges. If that structure existed at around 200 miles, and if the missiles were experiencing electrical failures as they approached that altitude, then maybe those failures weren't failures at all. Maybe they were countermeasures. He needed more information about what the scientists had been thinking. The official reports were sanitized, but scientists talked to each other. They shared ideas. They wrote proposals. He started searching for references to high-altitude phenomena in the scientific literature from the early 1960s. Most papers were about the radiation belts themselves. Van Allen's work, studies of solar particles, magnetosphere physics, standard space science. But he found a few odd references buried in conference proceedings and grant proposals. A 1960 proposal from the Air Force Office of Scientific Research referenced containment boundary studies at orbital altitudes. A 1961 symposium abstract mentioned artificial structures in near-Earth space environment. A 1963 grant application from Douglas Aircraft Company described resonance mapping of high-altitude geometric structures. These weren't mainstream topics. They were buried in technical documents that most people would never read. But they were there. A scattered paper trail suggesting that some scientists were investigating something unusual at high altitude. Evan started making phone calls. He needed to talk to anyone who'd been involved in these obscure projects. It took him 4 days to find someone willing to talk. Richard Torres, retired engineer from Douglas Aircraft Company, 78 years old, living in Henderson, Nevada, just outside Las Vegas. He'd worked on classified aerospace projects throughout the 1960s. "You're asking about some pretty old stuff," Torres said when Evan called. "Most of it's probably still classified." "I'm just trying to understand some anomalous data from the fishbowl tests," Evan said carefully. "I found a reference to resonance mapping work at Douglas in '63. Was that related to the nuclear tests?" A long silence on the other end. "Mr. Torres?" "I worked on something in '63, Torres said slowly. "Suborbital resonance mapping system. It was a weird project. We built equipment to measure echo patterns at high altitude. I never knew what it was for. They never told us. We just built the hardware and processed the data." "What kind of data?" "Reflection patterns. We were using high-powered radar to map something above the atmosphere. The signals would go up, hit something and bounce back. We'd measure the return signal and create a map." "A map of what?" "I didn't know at the time. I just processed numbers, created topographical plots. sent the results up the chain, but the plots showed structure, geometry, regular patterns at specific altitudes. Evan's heart rate increased. What kind of altitude? 200 to 240 miles. Right in the lower orbital range. The structure was massive, curved, like we were mapping the inside of a sphere. Did anyone ever tell you what you were mapping? No. The project shut down in November 63. Abrupt termination. They dismantled the equipment, reassigned all the personnel. My supervisor told me to forget I'd ever worked on it. Do you have any documentation from the project? I wasn't supposed to keep anything, but I made copies of some reports. I thought someday people might want to know what we'd been working on. After all this time, I figure the classification has probably expired. Evan felt a surge of excitement. Would you be willing to share those copies with me? Another silence. Can you come to Henderson? Torres asked. I don't like talking about this on the phone. 2 days later, Evan was sitting in Richard Torres's living room. The house was modest, filled with photographs of grandchildren and mementos from a long aerospace career. Torres moved slowly, age and arthritis limiting his mobility, but his mind was sharp. He handed Evan a folder. Old photocopies, yellowed with age. The paper stock dated from the 1960s. Space Cave Preliminary Report, July 1963, the cover page read. Evan opened the folder carefully. The documents inside were marked with security classifications that had probably expired decades ago. He started reading. The first page described the project purpose in careful bureaucratic language. Development of suborbital resonance mapping capability for detection of structured phenomena at high altitude. The second page detailed the equipment specifications, high-powered radar transmitters, sensitive receivers, signal processing equipment, all designed to detect echoes from objects in low orbit. But it was the data section that made Evan's hands tremble. Test results from July 10th through July 30th, 1963 show consistent reflection signatures at altitudes between 210 and 240 miles. Reflection strength indicates solid or semi-solid material with geometric properties. Structure appears symmetrical across multiple measurement angles. Estimated surface area exceeds 10,000 square miles. Curvature analysis suggests spherical or near-spherical geometry with Earth at approximate centre. Material properties unknown. Further study recommended. Evan looked up at Torres. Did you understand what this meant when you wrote it? Torres shook his head. Not at the time. I just processed the numbers. It wasn't until you sent me that photograph that I understood what we'd been looking at. You're saying there's a structure surrounding Earth at 200 miles altitude. That's what the data showed. We weren't mapping the Earth. We were mapping what's above it. Evan turned to the next page. It contained a rough plot of the reflection data, a curved line representing the structure's surface. Measurement points plotted along its length, error bars showing the uncertainty in each measurement. The curvature was consistent with a sphere centered on Earth. If you extended the arc, it would form a complete shell around the planet at approximately 220 miles altitude. What happened after this report? Evan asked. Nothing. That was the last report. 2 weeks later they shut the project down, told us it was budget cuts, but I talked to the other engineers. They detected something, and someone high up decided we shouldn't be looking at it. Do you know who made that decision? No, but it came from somewhere with serious authority. The project had Air Force funding, good funding. Projects like that don't get cancelled unless someone very important wants them cancelled. Evan photographed every page of the report. Torres watched him work, then said something that made Evan's blood run cold. You know what the weird part was? We kept detecting the structure for weeks after the project ended. What do you mean? The equipment was still running for a while. We hadn't dismantled it yet, so I kept taking measurements. Unauthorised, but nobody was paying attention anymore. The structure was still there. Same altitude, same curvature, same reflection properties. Whatever it was permanent, not temporary, not experimental. It had been there all along, and we'd only just noticed it. Evan thought about the timeline. Argus in 58, 4 years of analysis, Fishbowl in 62, trying to reach higher altitudes, Space Cave in 63, mapping what was up there, and then silence, complete shutdown of any investigation. Mr. Torres, in your professional opinion, what was that structure? Torres was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. I'm an engineer, not a scientist. I deal with things I can measure and calculate. The measurements said there was structure at high altitude, solid material, geometric patterns, spherical curvature. Those are facts. What it means. He shook his head. That's above my pay grade. But I'll tell you what I think. Someone put something up there. A long time ago. Long before we had rockets or satellites. And in the 60s we finally got high enough to notice it. Who put it there? That's the question, isn't it? That's the question they didn't want us asking. Evan thanked Torres and drove back to his hotel. He sat in the parking lot for an hour, looking through the photographs he'd taken of the Space Cave report. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. There was a structure surrounding Earth at high altitude. The military had known about it since at least Argus in 58. They'd tried to investigate it with nuclear weapons in 62. They'd tried to map it with radar in 63. And then they'd classified everything and shut down all research. But why? What was so threatening about a structure in orbit that it required total suppression? Evan thought about Dyson's note from the symposium. Not invasion. Containment. They weren't worried about something attacking Earth. They were worried about something keeping humanity confined. A cage. A barrier. A wall between us and the rest of space. And the government had decided we weren't ready to know about it. Chapter 3. The hidden programs. Back in his office, Evan pinned the Space Cave report photographs to his wall next to Laura's image. The structure in the photograph matched the description in the report. Same altitude, same curvature, same geometric properties. 2 independent sources. A photograph from 62, a radar mapping report from 63, both showing the same thing. But he needed to know more about the government's response. How had they organised the cover-up? Who was involved? What programs had been created to study this phenomenon in secret? He started searching for references to high-altitude research programs from the 1960s. Not the public programs like Mercury and Gemini, the classified ones, the programs that existed in budget documents but nowhere else. Project Defender caught his attention first. Defender had been an early missile defence initiative from the late 1950s and early 60s. The official goal was to develop systems for shooting down Soviet ICBMs. Evan had written about Defender in his second book. He thought he knew the program well, but when he requested the complete archive of Defender documents, he found references he'd missed before. Sky Shield, Phase 2, Containment, Interference Studies. That program name had been buried in a budget allocation document from 1961. Evan had skimmed past it years ago, assuming it was just another missile defence sub-study. Now he looked at it more carefully. The document listed 3 principal scientists. Nicholas Christopoulos, Greek physicist. He'd proposed the original concept for Operation Argus, the idea of using nuclear weapons to create artificial radiation belts. Brilliant but controversial, he'd worked on numerous classified projects throughout the 50s and 60s. Hans Bethe, Manhattan Project scientist, Nobel Prize winner, one of the most respected physicists of his generation. If Bethe was involved, this was serious theoretical work. Edward Teller, father of the hydrogen bomb, controversial figure known for pushing the boundaries of nuclear weapons design. He'd championed numerous extreme concepts, including nuclear-powered rockets and weapons that could destroy entire continents. These weren't minor researchers. These were 3 of the most important physicists in the American nuclear program. Their involvement suggested Sky Shield was more than a simple missile defense study. Evan found a digitized copy of the 1961 Sky Shield planning meeting notes. Most of the document was routine discussion of radar systems and tracking protocols. But in the margins, someone had made handwritten notes. The handwriting matched Nicholas Christopoulos' signature on other documents. Evan had seen enough of Christopoulos' papers to recognise his distinctive style. The note read, "Barrier exists. Question is, natural or manufactured?" Evan stared at that sentence. Barrier exists, not might exist, not possibly exists, exists. Present tense, definite. And the question wasn't whether it existed. The question was its origin, natural or manufactured. This was written in early 1961, before the fishbowl tests, which meant they'd already known about the barrier before they started detonating nuclear weapons near it. Fishbowl hadn't been an exploratory test. It had been a targeted investigation of something they already knew was there. Evan dug deeper into the Defender archives. He found a second reference to Sky Shield in a 1962 technical review. This one mentioned radiation barrier properties and containment field interactions. Those weren't missile defense terms. Those were terms for studying a physical barrier at high altitude. He found a third reference in a 1963 document. This one was more explicit. Sky Shield. Phase 2 concluded that barrier phenomenon represents structured material of unknown origin. Conventional detection methods insufficient. Nuclear probe testing recommended. See Operation Fishbowl results for preliminary data. There it was. Direct confirmation that Sky Shield and Fishbowl were connected. They'd been studying the same barrier, and Fishbowl had been the nuclear probe testing phase. But the document was dated September 1963, after Fishbowl had ended, which meant this was a post-operation assessment, looking back at what they'd learned. Evan searched for any Sky Shield documents after 63. He found nothing. The program appeared to have ended abruptly, just like Space Cave. As if someone had decided all investigation should stop. He needed to find other programs that might have been studying this. The government wouldn't just give up on something this significant. They'd continue investigating, but under different program names. Deeper classification, compartmentalized security. He started looking for references to atmospheric or orbital research in the mid-1960s. Anything that seemed unusually classified or involved the same scientists who'd worked on Sky Shield. He found several curious program references. Project HARP, High Altitude Research Program. Official purpose was studying ballistics and satellite deployment, but one budget document mentioned barrier penetration studies. Project GREAT, Geophysical Research at Extended Altitude Trajectories. This one was explicitly about launching probes above 200 miles, but funding ended abruptly in late 1962. Project Upshot, classification level so high that most documents just reference the program name without describing its purpose. But one personnel transfer order mentioned orbital boundary investigations. These programs had all operated in the early to mid-60s, all focused on high altitude, all classified, all terminated around 1963 or 64. The pattern was clear. The government had been running multiple programs to study the barrier, and then they'd shut all of them down simultaneously. Something had happened in 63 that made them decide investigation was too dangerous. Evan needed to know what that decision point was. He started looking for high-level policy documents from that period. He found it in a CIA memorandum from 1978. The memo had been declassified in 2012, but it had never been indexed properly, so it had languished in the archives unnoticed. OPF B-72, Post-Fishbowl Assessment. The date was interesting. 1978. 16 years after Fishbowl. Why were they doing a post-operation assessment so long after the tests? The memo was addressed to 4 recipients. Robert Varney, NASA official. He'd been involved in early satellite programs and had high-level security clearances. Colonel Francis Kane, Air Force Space Systems Division, career military officer specializing in orbital systems. Lloyd Berkner, geophysicist, pioneer in ionosphere research. He'd been on advisory committees for numerous classified programs. and one name that was redacted. Just a black rectangle where the name should have been. The memo's content was mostly administrative. Discussion of whether fishbowl-related documents should remain classified. Assessment of whether the data was still sensitive 16 years later. But the final paragraph made Evan's pulse quicken. Recommend total suppression of all evidence of the barrier phenomenon discovered during OPFB activities. Continued investigation poses unacceptable risk to social stability and international relations. Current monitoring protocols should continue indefinitely, but no new active investigation authorised. This position unchanged since original 63 directive. Barrier phenomenon, capital letters. They'd given it an official name, and the recommendation was total suppression. Not just classification, suppression, erasure of evidence, because investigation posed unacceptable risk to social stability. Evan thought about what that meant. Social stability, not national security, not military advantage, social stability. They weren't worried about the Soviets learning about this. They were worried about the public learning about it. What would happen if humanity discovered there was a physical barrier preventing us from leaving Earth? What would that do to our sense of purpose, our space program, our philosophical and religious frameworks? The 1960s had been the height of space race optimism. We'd put men in orbit. We were planning moon landings. The future seemed unlimited. Space was the new frontier. How would people have reacted to learning that frontier had a wall? That we were confined? Contained? Evan understood the suppression now. Not because the information was militarily sensitive, because it was psychologically destabilizing. Better to let people believe space was open and accessible than to tell them we were living in a cage. But the memo mentioned continued monitoring, which meant they hadn't stopped watching the barrier. They'd just stopped investigating it actively. Evan started looking for modern surveillance programs that might be monitoring high-altitude phenomena. This was harder. Recent programs were still classified. FOIA requests would take years to process, and most information would be heavily redacted. But he found a curious reference in an NSA budget justification from 1986. Continued surveillance of anomalous orbital reflections at radiative boundary layers. The memo was signed by Lieutenant General William Odom. He'd been NSA director in the mid-80s. Anomalous orbital reflections, radiative boundary layers. They were still watching it, still measuring it. 40 years after Fishbowl, which meant the barrier was permanent, not a temporary phenomenon, not an experimental installation. It had been there in the 50s, it had been there in the 60s, and it was still there in the 80s, and presumably still there now. Evan thought about the implications. A permanent structure at orbital altitude, surrounding the entire Earth, existing since before we had the technology to detect it. Someone had built this. Something had built this. And our government had known about it for 70 years and never told anyone. He needed one more piece of confirmation. He needed to find evidence that modern scientists were still encountering the barrier. He started searching for references to unusual observations from recent space missions. Satellite anomalies, atmospheric measurements that didn't fit models, anything that might indicate modern sensors were still detecting the structure. He found several curious reports. A 2012 NASA technical paper mentioned unexpected radar returns from orbital altitudes inconsistent with debris or satellite signatures. A 2016 Air Force Space Command memo referenced persistent anomalous readings from DSP satellites at radiative boundary regions. A 2019 SpaceX engineering report noted intermittent signal reflections from high-altitude sources, origin unknown. These were all carefully worded to avoid suggesting anything definitive, but the pattern was there. Modern spacecraft were still detecting something at the same altitude where the barrier had been observed in the 60s. Evan compiled everything into a timeline. 1958, Argus tests detect anomalous responses at high altitude. 1961, Sky Shield confirms barrier exists. 1962. Fishbowl attempts nuclear probe testing of barrier. 1963. Space Cave maps barrier with radar. All programs terminated. 1978. Assessment recommends continued suppression. 1986. NSA confirms continued surveillance. 2000 to present. Modern spacecraft still detecting the structure. 70 years of evidence. Multiple independent confirmations and complete suppression of the information. Evan sat back and looked at his research wall. Photographs, documents, timelines, quotes from scientists. All of it pointing to one inescapable conclusion. Earth was enclosed, not by accident, not by natural phenomenon, by design. Something or someone had built a physical barrier around our planet. A shell at approximately 220 miles altitude, large enough to be visible from the ground under the right conditions, solid enough to reflect nuclear shock waves, permanent enough to persist for at least 70 years. And the United States government had discovered it in the 1950s and decided humanity wasn't ready to know. Chapter 4. The modern connection. Evan might have stopped there, written a book, made his case with historical documents, but he wanted to know if the barrier was still being observed by modern systems. He started monitoring space industry news more carefully. SpaceX launches, satellite deployments, International Space Station operations, anything that might involve spacecraft operating near the 200-mile altitude where the barrier existed. Most launches went smoothly. Satellites deployed successfully. No unusual reports, but occasionally there were anomalies that caught his attention. In 2022, SpaceX launched a batch of Starlink satellites. These communication satellites operate in low Earth orbit, typically between 300 and 400 miles altitude. They carry cameras for Earth imaging and solar monitoring. One of these satellites captured an unusual image during a solar observation session. The image showed the sun's corona, but in the foreground there was a faint arc, a curve that didn't match any known orbital debris or satellite constellation pattern. NASA's explanation was brief. Sensor ghosting artifact common in space-based optical systems. No anomaly detected. But Evan obtained the raw image data through a contact at SpaceX. When he processed the image with enhanced contrast, the arc became clearer. It had depth, shadow properties, three-dimensional structure. He overlaid the arc with Laura's photograph from the fishbowl film. The geometry matched. Exactly. Same curvature, same altitude, same relative position to Earth's horizon. Whatever had been there in 1962 was still there 60 years later. Evan documented the match and started looking for other modern observations. He found several. A 2018 paper by Chinese satellite researchers mentioned unexpected microwave reflections from atmospheric boundary regions. A 2019 International Space Station crew report noted unusual visual phenomena during orbital sunrise at approximately 220 miles altitude. A 2020 amateur radio operator community discussion described persistent signal bouncing from unknown source at low orbital altitudes. None of these reports explicitly acknowledged a structure, but they all described observations consistent with a physical barrier at the same altitude. Evan found one more interesting reference, an astronaut quote that had been quickly dismissed as a misstatement. Jeremy Hansen, Canadian astronaut, highly experienced, not prone to making careless statements. In 2014, he'd given a presentation at a university about his time aboard the International Space Station. During the Q&A session, a student asked about the challenges of operating at orbital altitudes. Hansen's response was recorded. There are things I can't talk about regarding the upper atmospheric boundary, but I can say that the environment at those altitudes is more complex than the public realizes. We observe phenomena that aren't fully explained by current models. Within hours, NASA issued a clarification. Hansen had been referring to classified military satellite operations. Nothing unusual, just standard operational security. But Evan noticed the specific phrase, upper atmospheric boundary. Not space, not orbit, boundary. The same terminology that kept appearing in the classified documents from the 60s. Barrier, boundary, containment. Hansen wasn't talking about satellites. He was talking about the structure. Evan tried to contact Hansen for an interview. The request was declined. Hansen's management company sent a polite email saying he wasn't available for interviews about technical spaceflight topics. But the quote was on record, and it matched everything else Evan had found. He compiled all the modern evidence into a comprehensive report. The historical tests from the 60s, the mapping data from Space Cave, the CIA memoranda, the NSA surveillance references, the modern satellite observations, the astronaut statement. All of it pointing to the same conclusion. There was a structure surrounding Earth. It had been there for at least 70 years, possibly much longer, and our government knew about it and was actively suppressing the information. Evan prepared to publish. He had enough evidence, enough documentation, enough credibility as a researcher to get mainstream attention. He wrote a draft article, 15,000 words, footnoted, carefully worded. He wasn't claiming to know what the structure was or who built it. He was simply presenting the evidence that it existed and that the government knew about it. He sent the draft to 3 colleagues for peer review. All 3 were experienced researchers who'd published on classified programs before. He trusted them to give honest feedback. 2 of them responded positively. The evidence was compelling. The documentation was solid. They encouraged him to publish. The 3rd colleague, a retired Air Force intelligence officer, sent a different kind of response. Evan, this is fascinating work, but I need to warn you. This topic is actively protected. Not just classified, protected. I've seen researchers lose their careers investigating similar phenomena. Be very careful about who you share this with. Evan appreciated the warning, but he'd already decided. The evidence needed to be public. People deserved to know. He contacted several science journalists he'd worked with before. He offered them the story, exclusive access to all his documentation. One journalist was interested. She worked for a major magazine with a reputation for serious investigative reporting. They set up a meeting. That night, Evan's phone died. Not low battery, completely dead. Wouldn't turn on, wouldn't charge, just a black screen. He tried his backup phone. Same thing. Dead within minutes. His laptop shut down while he was working on it. Completely unresponsive. The hard drive was wiped. Every file gone. His external backup drives locked themselves with encryption he hadn't applied. Password prompts he couldn't bypass. His cloud storage accounts were deleted. All files vanished. In the span of 4 hours, every digital device he owned became useless. Every file he'd accumulated over 6 months of research was gone. Evan sat in his office, surrounded by dead electronics, trying to understand what had just happened. Then he saw the message. It appeared on his dead laptop screen. The screen that had been black and unresponsive seconds ago. White text on black background. No windows, no interface. Just text. You're investigating a classified structure. This is your final warning. The message displayed for 5 seconds. Then the screen went black again. Evan felt his chest tighten. They'd been watching him. They knew everything he'd been researching, and they just demonstrated they could reach into his personal electronics at will. He left his office immediately, packed a bag from his apartment, took only cash and paper documents, left all his electronics behind. He checked into a hotel in Cincinnati 2 hours from his home. He used a fake name and paid cash. He needed time to think. Someone had been monitoring his research, someone with resources beyond what he'd imagined. Not just classified programs, not just government agencies, something with reach into private infrastructure, private companies, private networks. They could access his devices remotely. delete files across multiple platforms simultaneously, display messages on powered-down screens. That level of capability wasn't normal government surveillance. That was something else. Something with backdoor access to fundamental internet infrastructure. Evan spent 3 days in hotel rooms, moving between cities, trying to figure out his next move. He couldn't use computers, couldn't use phones, couldn't access any of his research digitally. But he still had one thing. The original USB drive Laura had sent him. The one with the photograph. He'd kept it separate from his other backups, stored in a safety deposit box at his bank. He retrieved it and looked at the image again. The arc, the structure, the impossible object that shouldn't exist. This was the only copy left. Everything else had been erased. He needed to get this image out to the public before they found a way to delete it too. He went to a public library, used their computers with a VPN and multiple proxy servers, created anonymous accounts on multiple platforms, prepared to upload the image everywhere simultaneously. Before he uploaded, he wrote a brief explanation. Just the key facts, no speculation, just evidence. Then he uploaded everything at once. Reddit, Twitter, image hosting sites, conspiracy forums, file-sharing networks, everywhere he could think of. For about 4 hours it spread. People started seeing it, discussing it, analysing it, comparing it to other space photographs. The conversation was building momentum. Then it started disappearing. Post by post, platform by platform, the image was being removed. Not just his original uploads, the copies people had made, screenshots, downloads, everything. Within 12 hours, every instance of the image was gone. Even the people who'd saved it to their personal devices reported that the files had corrupted or disappeared. Evan tried uploading it, again from the library computer. His accounts were immediately suspended. Permanent bans, no appeals. He created new accounts. They were banned before he could post anything. He tried other libraries, other cities. Same result. Instant bans. Immediate removal. Whatever surveillance system he'd triggered was comprehensive. They were watching every public computer he accessed, every account he created, every file he tried to upload. The net was complete. Evan sat in his car in a library parking lot holding the USB drive, trying to figure out what to do next. He thought about the journalists he'd contacted. He called one of them from a payphone. She answered. "I can't talk about this," she said immediately. "I've been advised that the story isn't viable." "Who advised you?" "I can't say, but the message was clear. This isn't a story we're going to pursue. I'm sorry, Evan." She hung up. He tried the other journalists, same response. Polite refusals, no explanation. Just sudden disinterest in a story they'd been excited about days earlier. Someone had gotten to them, applied pressure, made it clear this story wasn't to be published. Evan had one option left: physical distribution. He couldn't rely on digital systems, but he could mail copies to people, create physical documentation that couldn't be remotely deleted. He wrote out his entire investigation by hand. 20 pages. Key facts, document references, contact information for everyone he'd interviewed. He made 10 copies at a print shop paying cash. He addressed them to 3 different journalists, 2 university researchers, 3 science writers, and 2 documentary filmmakers. People he trusted, people with platforms, people who might be willing to take risks. He mailed them from different post offices in different cities, used fake return addresses, spread the mailings across a week to avoid pattern detection. Then he waited. 2 weeks later, he started getting responses. Every envelope had arrived empty, just blank pages. They'd intercepted physical mail, opened the envelopes, removed the contents, resealed them, all without leaving evidence of tampering. That level of operational capability suggested resources beyond any single agency. This wasn't just the CIA or NSA. This was coordinated action across multiple systems: postal service, internet infrastructure, financial networks, media companies. Someone wanted this information buried, and they had the power to make it happen across every possible distribution channel. Evan realised he was dealing with something much bigger than he had understood. This wasn't just about a classified program. This was about controlling information at a fundamental level. Controlling what humanity was allowed to know about its own planet, and they were willing to use extraordinary measures to maintain that control. Chapter 5. The final attempt. Evan had one last idea. A peer-to-peer file-sharing network, the kind that distributed data across thousands of computers simultaneously, making it nearly impossible to eliminate completely. If he could get the file seeded into one of these networks, it would propagate beyond any single point of control. Even if they deleted most copies, some would survive. Eventually someone would notice. Eventually the evidence would reach critical mass. He spent his last free day preparing the file, the photograph, a written summary of his findings, excerpts from the documents he'd photographed, contact information for Margaret Reeves and Richard Torres, everything he could fit into a compressed archive. He encrypted it using open source software, set up a Tor node, prepared to upload it to multiple peer-to-peer networks simultaneously. He chose networks that were designed for exactly this kind of distributed archiving. Networks where files persisted even if the original uploader went offline. Networks that were used by journalists and activists to preserve documents that powerful organisations wanted destroyed. He initiated the upload from a coffee shop in Detroit. The file began propagating, node to node, computer to computer, each copy creating more copies, distributed across the network in fragments, no single machine holding the complete file. For 6 hours, it worked. The file spread. The distribution counter climbed. 10,000 copies, 20,000, 50,000. People started accessing it, downloading it, opening it, reading the evidence. Evan monitored the network activity from the coffee shop. He watched the counter climb, watched the geographic distribution spread across continents. Then it started dropping. Slowly at first, a few nodes going offline, then faster, hundreds of nodes, thousands. Something was sweeping through the network, deleting the file, not just from new uploads, from existing nodes, from computers that had already downloaded it. Evan watched in real time as the counter dropped. 50,000 copies, 40,000, 20,000, 10,000, 5,000, 1,000, 100, 0. They'd eliminated it from a distributed network, something that should have been technically impossible. They'd found a way to remotely delete files from thousands of individual computers simultaneously. The scope of that capability was staggering. That wasn't normal law enforcement. That wasn't standard intelligence agency power. That was infrastructure-level access, backdoors into operating systems, control over fundamental internet protocols. Evan closed his laptop and left the coffee shop. He didn't know if they could track his physical location yet, but he wasn't going to risk staying in one place. He drove to a park, sat on a bench, thought about what he'd learned over the past 6 months. A structure surrounding Earth, confirmed by multiple independent sources, nuclear tests in the 60s, radar mapping in the 60s, modern satellite observations, astronaut statements, all pointing to the same thing. A government cover-up spanning 70 years, classification, suppression, active denial, scientists silenced, programs terminated, evidence destroyed, and a surveillance and control apparatus capable of reaching into any digital system anywhere in the world to eliminate information they didn't want public. Evan pulled out his phone. He'd bought a new one, prepaid, cash purchase. He recorded one final message. "My name is Evan Mercer. I'm an aerospace historian. For the past 6 months I've been investigating evidence of a structure surrounding Earth at high altitude. Evidence that our government has known about this structure since 1958. evidence that they attempted to break through it using nuclear weapons in 1962. Evidence that they've been hiding this truth for over 70 years. I've documented everything: historical tests, classified memos, scientific reports, modern observations. All of it confirms the same thing. There's a physical barrier at approximately 220 miles altitude. It's been there since before we had the technology to detect it, and our government decided we're not allowed to know about it. I've been threatened. My research has been destroyed. Every digital file I had has been erased. The people I interviewed have been silenced or have recanted their statements. Every attempt I've made to share this information has been blocked. But I need you to know something. The evidence is real. The structure is real. And they're hiding it because they know what it means. We're not explorers looking out at the universe. We're specimens being kept in. And someone decided a long time ago that we're better off not knowing that. He uploaded the video to a temporary hosting site. It lasted 40 minutes before being removed. Long enough for a few hundred people to see it, but not long enough to spread widely. Evan had one more thing to do. The USB drive with Laura's original photograph, the only copy that still existed. He couldn't distribute it digitally. They'd just delete it. He couldn't mail it domestically. They'd intercept it. But he had a friend in Norway, Lars Johansson. They'd met at a conference years ago. Lars worked at a small research institute outside Oslo. He was outside the American intelligence sphere, outside the immediate reach of whoever was suppressing this information. Evan packaged the USB drive in a waterproof case, addressed it to Lars at his institute, sent it via international express mail from a random post office in Indiana. Then he drove back to his apartment in Columbus. He knew what was coming. They'd let him run for weeks, probably watching to see who he contacted, what methods he tried, how far his information spread. Now they'd closed the loop. 2 men in civilian suits were waiting in his hallway when he arrived. Not police, not FBI agents with badges and warrants. Just 2 men who looked like they could be accountants or insurance salesmen, unremarkable, forgettable, except for their eyes, alert, trained, dangerous in a way that didn't require visible weapons. "Mr. Mercer," one of them said, "we need you to come with us." Evan didn't resist. He'd known this was coming. He'd done everything he could. Now it was out of his hands. "Where are we going?" he asked. "A debriefing facility. You'll be briefed on information classification procedures. You'll sign some documents. Then you'll go home. And if I don't sign..." The man smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. "Then the debriefing takes longer, but the outcome is the same. You'll sign." They escorted him to an unmarked sedan. Dark windows, no government plates. Just an anonymous vehicle that could have belonged to anyone. As they drove, Evan looked out the window at the city passing by. He thought about Laura Benton, who disappeared after seeing that film reel. About Margaret Reeves, who'd told him about the structure and then recanted. About Richard Torres, who'd kept documentation for 40 years and finally shared it. He thought about all the scientists who'd seen the evidence and chosen silence. Van Allen, Christopoulos, Wolfe, Craven. Men who'd made careers studying space and then stopped asking certain questions. He thought about the structure itself, the massive arc in Laura's photograph, the radar returns in the Space Cave report, the modern satellite observations, 70 years of evidence, all pointing to the same impossible truth. Something surrounded Earth. Something that had been there longer than our space program. Something that someone had decided we weren't allowed to know about. And he thought about Dyson's handwritten note from the symposium. Not invasion, containment. That's what this was. Not protection from external threats. Containment of humanity. A barrier keeping us confined to our planet. The question nobody had asked yet was the most important one. Who built it, and why? Epilogue. The frame that survived. 3 months after Evan Mercer was escorted into an unmarked sedan, A package arrived at the Nansen Institute for Environmental Research in Oslo, Norway. Lars Johansen, atmospheric physicist, received the package at his office. It had been sitting in customs for 2 weeks before finally being released. No explanation for the delay, just a stamp indicating it had been inspected and cleared. Inside was a waterproof case, inside that a USB drive. Inside that, a single image file and a text document explaining what it showed. Lars opened the image. His first thought was that it was another nuclear test photograph. He'd seen dozens of them. Declassified images from the Cold War, nothing unusual. But then he read Evan's explanation. The date, the altitude, the structure that appeared for half a second during the flash. Lars enhanced the image, adjusted contrast, increased brightness, isolated the structure from the background radiation, and he saw what Evan had seen, a massive arc, regular curvature, defined edges, something solid at 200 miles altitude. But Lars went further. He had access to image processing software that Evan hadn't used. Software designed for analysing satellite imagery and telescopic observations. He applied spectral analysis to the structure, measured the light reflectivity, analysed the shadow patterns. The structure wasn't just a barrier, it had features. Lars zoomed in on the enhanced version. Behind the main arc, barely visible in the original, now clear after processing, were lights. Not stars. The wavelength was wrong. The pattern was wrong. These were artificial lights, arranged in patterns, geometric shapes, a grid. Lars felt his chest tighten. He zoomed in further. The lights were regularly spaced, precise intervals, mathematical regularity. And between the lights there were shapes, structural elements, what looked like support frameworks or attachment points. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. This wasn't even an accident of human construction. This was engineered. Someone had built this. Something had built this. Lars saved the enhanced image. He stared at it for 20 minutes, trying to wrap his mind around what he was seeing. A wall around Earth, a constructed barrier, covered in lights and structures, surrounding the entire planet. He thought about the implications. Every space mission had launched through this barrier. Every satellite that reached orbit had passed through it. Every astronaut who'd looked out the window had potentially seen it. And nobody had said anything. Or if they had, they'd been silenced. Lars reached for his phone to call colleagues, to share this, to start asking questions. Then he stopped. He thought about what had happened to Evan, the destroyed research, the deleted files, the intercepted mail, the men who'd taken him away. He thought about what Evan had written in his explanation. They will do anything to keep this secret. Be careful who you trust. Lars looked at the enhanced image again, the lights, the grid, the structure. Some truths he realised were bigger than one person's need to share them. Some truths required preparation, planning, the right moment, the right circumstances. If he published this now, it would be deleted like everything else. He'd be silenced like everyone else, and the evidence would be lost again. But if he waited, if he preserved it carefully, if he prepared the ground properly, someday conditions might change. Someday the control apparatus might weaken. Someday enough people might be asking the right questions that the truth couldn't be suppressed anymore. Lars deleted the enhanced image from his computer, but he saved it to 3 encrypted drives, stored them in separate locations, created detailed instructions for accessing them to be opened only if specific conditions were met. He wrote a letter explaining everything, sealed it, left instructions, with his attorney to deliver it to specific people if he died or disappeared. Then he went back to his normal research, atmospheric measurements, climate modelling, ordinary science. But every night he looked up at the stars and thought about what he knew, about the wall just beyond the edge of space, about the lights and structures that covered it, about the question that nobody was allowed to ask. If there's a barrier keeping us in, who built it, and why? The answer to that question, Lars suspected, was the real reason for the suppression. Not just that the barrier existed, but what its existence implied about humanity's place in the universe. We weren't the explorers we thought we were something else. And whoever built that barrier had decided we should stay contained, at least for now. Until then, the frame remained, hidden but preserved, encrypted but recoverable, waiting for the right moment, waiting for conditions to change, waiting for the day when humanity would finally be ready to learn the truth about what happened in 1962, about what our government discovered, about what still hangs above us, silent and watching, keeping us contained, the truth about the barrier, the truth about Operation Fishbowl, the truth about the wall we can't cross, and about the lights on the other side, the lights that suggest we're not alone, that we've never been alone, that something has been watching us, managing us, containing us, for reasons we're not yet allowed to understand. Someday someone will ask the questions again. Someday someone will find the evidence Lars preserved. Someday the control will slip and the truth will emerge. And when it does, humanity will have to confront the most fundamental question we've ever faced. If we're being contained, what happens when they decide to let us out? Or worse, what happens if they never do?